Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight we embark on a peaceful journey through one of history's most overlooked monarchs, Ceol of Wessex, the forgotten king whose brief but pivotal reign shaped the destiny of Anglo-Saxon England from 592 to 597 AD. We'll softly explore the mysterious rise of a nephew who challenged his powerful uncle, the quiet consolidation of a fractured kingdom, and the gentle legacy that echoed through centuries of English royal history, all while the first whispers of Christianity began to transform the Anglo-Saxon world. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Which aspect of early Anglo-Saxon England fascinates you most? The warrior culture, the family dynasties, or perhaps the daily life of these ancient kingdoms? Your thoughts mean the world to me, and don't be shy. I read every single comment with genuine joy. If this gentle journey through history brings you comfort, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to keep these soothing historical tales coming your way. So cozy up, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from 6th century England lull you into restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. Ceol, later known as King Ceol of Wessex, emerged from the shadows of Anglo-Saxon history during one of the most turbulent periods in early English royal succession. Born around 570 AD into the prestigious lineage of the West Saxon royal house, his name itself whispers of maritime heritage. Ceol, meaning simply ship in the Old English tongue, though scholars debate whether this monothematic name reflects his true identity or perhaps a later scribal simplification of a more complex dithematic name like Ceola. The world into which Ceol was born was one of constant transformation, where the echoes of Roman civilization still lingered in abandoned villas and crumbling stone walls, while new Anglo-Saxon settlements spread like gentle ripples across the fertile valleys of southern England. The late 6th century marked a pivotal moment when the various Germanic tribes, Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, were no longer merely raiders or settlers, but had become the established rulers of kingdoms that would endure for centuries. Ceol's lineage traced directly to the legendary founder kings of Wessex. He was the son of Cutha, sometimes known as Cuthwolf, who himself was the brother of the mighty King Ceawlin. This made Ceol not merely a distant relative of royal blood, but the direct nephew of one of the most powerful rulers in 6th century Britain. His grandfather was Cynric, the co-founder of the West Saxon kingdom, alongside the semi-legendary Cerdic, creating an unbroken chain of royal descent that would prove crucial to his later claim to the throne. The significance of this bloodline cannot be understated in understanding the events that would unfold. In Anglo-Saxon society, kingship was not simply inherited through primogeniture, as it would be in later medieval periods. Instead, it was a more fluid concept where any member of the royal kin group or signing could potentially claim the throne if they possessed sufficient support, military strength, and political acumen. This system, while allowing for more capable rulers to emerge, also created the conditions for the internal conflicts that would define Ceol's path to power. Growing up in the shadow of his uncle's expanding kingdom, young Ceol would have witnessed the transformation of Wessex from a collection of scattered settlements into a formidable military power. The royal household in which he was raised operated as a mobile center of governance, traveling from estate to estate throughout the kingdom's territories. Here, surrounded by warriors, wise counselors, and visiting dignitaries from neighboring kingdoms, Ceol received the education befitting a potential king, training in weapons, horsemanship, the art of leadership, and the complex web of alliances and enmities that defined Anglo-Saxon politics. The atmosphere of the royal court during Ceol's youth would have been one of constant preparation and vigilance. The great hall, with its soaring timber roof and central hearth, served not only as a place of feasting and celebration, but as the nerve center of military political strategy. Around tables laden with mead horns and simple wooden bowls, the future of kingdoms was decided through a combination of ancient tradition, personal loyalty, and careful calculation of military strength and weaknesses. As Ceol matured into manhood during the 580s, he would have become increasingly aware of the growing tensions within the royal family. His father Cutha had died around 584 AD while campaigning alongside King Ceawlin in Oxfordshire, a loss that not only bereaved the young prince but also altered the delicate balance of power within the royal household. Without his father's guiding presence and political protection, Ceol found himself in an increasingly precarious position as various factions within the nobility began to coalesce around different potential successors to the aging king. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, our primary source for these distant events, records these developments with the sparse efficiency typical of early Middle historical writing. Yet between the brief entries noting battles won and kings died, we can glimpse the human drama of a young nobleman watching his world transform, preparing himself for the possibility that he might one day need to claim his birthright through force of arms rather than peaceful succession. The kingdom that Ceol observed from his position within the royal household was one of remarkable achievement. Under his uncle's, Ceolian had transformed Wessex from a relatively minor kingdom centered in Hampshire into a dominant power controlling much of southern England. His victories over the native British kingdoms had opened vast new territories for Anglo-Saxon settlement, while his defeat of rival Anglo-Saxon kingdoms like Kent had established Wessex as the premier power south of the River Thames. This expansion had brought not only territory but also wealth in the form of tribute from defeated enemies and the agricultural surplus of newly conquered lands. Yet success also bred new challenges. The larger Wessex became, the more difficult it proved to govern effectively with the limited administrative machinery available to 6th century rulers. Local nobles, appointed to govern distant territories, sometimes developed ambitions of their own. The native British populations, while defeated, remained a potential source of unrest, if not carefully managed. Most significantly, the very success that had elevated Wessex above its neighbors also made it an increasingly attractive target for ambitious rulers of neighboring kingdoms, particularly the rising power of Mercia in the Midlands. By the late 580s, these pressures were beginning to tell on King Ceawlin's rule. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records several military setbacks during this period, including a significant defeat at the hands of British forces that cost Ceawlin much of his recently won territory in the Upper Thames Valley. More ominously for the stability of the kingdom, there are hints in the surviving sources of growing discontent among the West Saxon nobility, some of whom apparently felt that the king's aggressive expansionist policies were exposing the kingdom to unnecessary risks. It was against this backdrop of military reverses and political tensions that Ceol began to emerge as a focal point for noble opposition to his uncle's rule. The exact process by which this opposition coalesced remains shrouded in the mists of early medieval politics, but we can imagine the careful conversations in private chambers, the subtle testing of loyalties, and the gradual building of alliances that preceded the dramatic events of 592 AD. The transformation of Ceol from loyal nephew to royal challenger represents one of those pivotal moments in history where personal ambition intersects with broader political forces to create irreversible change. His decision to move against his uncle was not merely a family quarrel, but the culmination of years of growing tension between different visions of how Wessex should be governed and what its role should. in the wider Anglo-Saxon world. As we prepare to follow Ceol's journey from prince to king, we must remember that we are witnessing not just the rise of one individual, but the playing out of fundamental questions about leadership, legitimacy, the nature of royal authority that would continue to shape English kingship for centuries to come. In the quiet moments before the storm that would sweep Ceol to power, we can almost hear the whispered conversations and careful preparations that would soon transform the political landscape of Anglo-Saxon England forever. To understand the magnitude of Ceol's challenge and the significance of his eventual victory, we must first immerse ourselves in the remarkable reign of his uncle, King Ceawlin of Wessex, whose 32 years on the throne from 560 to 592 AD transformed the West Saxon kingdom from a regional power into the dominant force in southern England. Ceawlin's reign represents one of the great success stories of early Anglo-Saxon kingship, a period when military genius combined with political acumen to create an empire that stretched from the Hampshire coast to the Welsh borders. When Ceawlin inherited the throne from his father Cynric around 560 AD, Wessex was still primarily to its original heartland in modern-day Hampshire and western Surrey. The kingdom's northern borders were constantly threatened by the expanding power of Mercia, while to the east lay the wealthy and sophisticated Kingdom of Kent, whose rulers had grown rich through trade with the Frankish kingdoms across the English Channel. The native British kingdoms still controlled much of the territory that would later become core areas of West Saxon power, including the vital Thames Valley and the rich agricultural lands of Gloucestershire and Wiltshire. Ceawlin's response to these challenges was characteristically aggressive and remarkably successful. Rather than remain content with defending his inherited territories, he embarked on a series of military campaigns that would fundamentally redraw the map of England. His first major victory came in 568 AD, when he decisively defeated Ethelbert of Kent at the Battle of Vibendun, demonstrating that Wessex could not only defend itself but could successfully challenge the most established Anglo-Saxon kingdom. This victory against Kent was particularly significant because it marked the first major conflict between different Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, as opposed to the earlier pattern of Germanic settlers fighting against native British resistance. The battle represented a new phase in the political development of early England, where the various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had grown sufficiently strong and confident to begin competing directly with each other for supremacy. Ceawlin's victory established him as more than just another local warlord. He had proven himself capable of defeating sophisticated opponents with well-established military traditions. The success against Kent was followed by an even more ambitious campaign against the British kingdoms of the West. In 577 AD, Ceawlin achieved perhaps his greatest military triumph at the Battle of Durham in Gloucestershire, where his forces decisively defeated a coalition of British kings and captured the important cities of Bath, Cirencester, and Gloucester. This victory was transformative not only for its immediate military results, but for its long-term strategic implications. The capture of these three cities gave Wessex control of the Severn Valley and effectively severed the connection between the British kingdoms of Wales and their kinsmen in the southwest peninsula that would later become Devon and Cornwall. More importantly, it opened vast new territories for Anglo-Saxon settlement and brought under West Saxon control some of the richest agricultural lands in Britain. The Roman infrastructure that still functioned in these cities, roads, fortifications, and administrative buildings, provided Ceawlin with governmental capabilities far beyond what was available in the more recently established Anglo-Saxon territories. The aftermath of Durham saw a systematic colonization of the newly conquered territories, as West Saxon nobles were granted estates throughout Gloucestershire and the Upper Thames Valley. This expansion created new opportunities for advancement within the West Saxon nobility, but it also created new challenges for royal governance. The kingdom now stretched across a much larger geographical area, making communication and coordination more difficult, while the integration of British populations created potential sources of internal unrest. Ceolin's military successes during the 570s and early 580s earned him recognition as one of the great warrior kings of his age. The later Anglo-Saxon Chronicle would list him as the second Bretwalda, or wide rule, acknowledging his status as an overlord who exercised authority not only over his own kingdom, but over neighboring realms as well. This recognition reflected not only his military achievements, but also his success in creating a network of alliances and tributary relationships that extended West Saxon influence far beyond the kingdom's form. The royal court that developed under Ceolin's rule became a center of attraction for ambitious warriors and political opportunists from throughout the Anglo-Saxon world. The king's warband, or comitatus, grew to include not only West Saxon nobles, but also adventurers from other kingdoms who were drawn by the promise of land, treasure, and advancement through military service. This cosmopolitan character of Ceolin's court exposed young nobles like his nephew Ceol to a broader range of political ideas and military techniques than would have been available in a more insular kingdom. The wealth that flowed into Wessex through conquest and tribute during Ceolin's reign transformed not only the kingdom's military capabilities but also its cultural life. Archaeological evidence from this period shows a marked increase in the quality and quantity of luxury goods found in West Saxon graves, including fine jewelry, decorated weapons, and imported pottery that testified to expanded trade connections. The royal household itself became more elaborate, with specialist craftsmen producing the regalia and ceremonial objects that emphasized the king's elevated status. Yet even as Ceolin's power reached its zenith in the early 580s, subtle signs of future difficulties were beginning to emerge. The very success of his expansionist policies had created new vulnerabilities that would eventually prove fatal to his reign. The enlarged kingdom required more complex administrative arrangements than had been necessary when Wessex was a smaller, more cohesive realm. Local governors, appointed to rule distant territories, sometimes developed independent power bases that challenged royal authority. The integration of conquered British populations remained incomplete, creating potential sources of rebellion that rival kingdoms might exploit. More ominously, Ceolin's aggressive expansionism had made enemies of neighboring kingdoms that were themselves growing in power and confidence. The kingdom of Mercia, in particular, viewed the expansion of West Saxon influence into the Thames Valley as a direct threat to its own ambitions for hegemony over central England. King Penda of Mercia, who would later become one of the most formidable opponents of Anglo-Saxon Christianity, was already beginning to forge the alliances that would challenge West Saxon dominance. The first serious military verse of Ceolin's reign came in 500 AD at the Battle of, probably fought in Oxfordshire, where a coalition of British and possibly Mercian forces inflicted a significant defeat on the West Saxon army. Among the casualties of this battle was Cutha, Ceol's father, and Ceolin's, whose death not only represented a personal loss for the royal, but also removed one of the king's most trusted military commanders, political advisor. The defeat at Fethenly marked of a gradual West Saxon power that would characterize the final year of Ceolin's reign. Territory that had been won through decades of military campaigns began to slip away as local British populations reasserted their independence, and rival Anglo-Saxon kingdoms pressed their own territorial claims. The tribute payments that had enriched the royal treasury began to dry up as former vassals calculated that Ceolin's military power was no longer sufficient to enforce their submission. Perhaps more dangerous than these external challenges was the growing discontent within Wessex itself. The The military setbacks of the mid-580s had shaken confidence in Ceawlin's leadership, who had grown accustomed to a seemingly endless succession of victories and territorial gain. The loss of tribute income meant that the king had fewer resources available to reward loyal and bind potential rivals to his cause through generous gift-giving, a crucial element of Anglo-Saxon political culture. The death of Cutha had removed not only a competent military leader but also a potential mediator who might have helped resolve the growing tensions between different factions within the royal family. Without his brother's moderating influence, Ceawlin appears to have become increasingly isolated from some segments of the West Saxon nobility, relying more heavily on a narrow circle of advisors whose counsel may not have accurately reflected the broader mood of the kingdom. It was in this context of military reverse, political discontent, and family tragedy that Ceol began to emerge as a focal point for noble opposition to his uncle's continued. The young prince, now in his early 20s and seasoned by years of observation and possibly military service, represented both continuity with the glorious past of West Saxon expansion and the possibility of new leadership that might be better adapted to the changed circumstances of the late 580s. The exact process by which opposition to Ceawlin crystallized around his neck remains obscure, hidden behind the formal language of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and the natural reticence of early medieval sources to discuss the internal politics of royal courts. Yet we can imagine the careful conversations in private chambers, the testing of loyalty through seemingly casual remarks, and the gradual construction of alliances that would eventually make possible the dramatic events of 592 AD. As the decade of the 580s drew to a close, the stage was set for one of the most significant political upheavals in early West Saxon history. The mighty King Ceawlin, whose military genius had transformed Wessex into the dominant power in southern England, found himself increasingly challenged not by foreign enemies, but by his own nephew, whose royal blood and growing political support threatened to bring down the dynasty that had ruled Wessex for over 70 years. To truly appreciate the world in which Ceol lived and ruled, we must step back and survey the broader landscape of 6th century Britain, still bearing the 4 centuries of Roman rule, while simultaneously witnessing the emergence of new Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that would shape the future of England. This was an age of transformation where ancient British traditions intersected with Germanic customs to create something entirely new, a uniquely Anglo-Saxon civilization that combined the military prowess of warrior culture with the administrative sophistication inherited from Rome. When the last Roman legions departed Britain around 410 AD, they left behind a complex legacy that would influence political development for centuries to come. The Roman road network, stretching like stone arteries across the landscape, continued to facilitate trade and communication between distant regions. Roman cities, though often reduced in size and population, remained important centers of craft production and local governance. Most significantly, the Roman concept of centralized authority or large territories had demonstrated the advantages of political unity, even as the practical mechanisms for achieving such unity had largely vanished with the departure of administration. Into this post-Roman landscape came successive waves of Germanic settlers, Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, whose arrival marked the beginning of what scholars now call the Anglo-Saxon period. These were not random bands of raiders, but organized groups led by warrior aristocrats who brought with them sophisticated military techniques, complex social hierarchies, and political traditions that would prove remarkably adaptable to British conditions. The process of settlement was neither uniformly peaceful nor universally violent, but rather a complex interaction between incoming Germanic peoples and native British populations that varied considerably from region to region. By the time of Ceol's birth, around 570 AD, this process of settlement and political consolidation had produced what later historians would term the Heptarchy, 7 major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that dominated different regions of what would eventually become England. These kingdoms, Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, and Sussex, represented successful experiments in creating stable political units that could effectively govern territories much larger than the tribal regions from which they had emerged. Each of these kingdoms had developed its own distinctive character based on geographical location, the nature of its founding population, and its particular historical experiences. Kent, positioned strategically across the English Channel from Frankish Gaul, had developed extensive trade connections that brought continental influences in art, law, and eventually religion. The kingdom's proximity to the continent also made it the natural entry point for Christian missionaries, a development that would prove crucial to the religious transformation of Anglo-Saxon England during the late 6th century. Northumbria, stretching from the Humber estuary to the Scottish borders, combined the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Bernicia and Deira into a formidable military power that dominated northern England. The harsh frontier conditions of Northumbrian territory had produced a particularly martial culture where kings needed to be first and foremost successful war leaders capable of defending their people against Scottish raids and internal rebellions. This military focus would make Northumbria one of the most powerful kingdoms of the 7th century, though its exposed position would also make it vulnerable to later Viking attacks. East Anglia, occupying the fertile lowlands of modern Norfolk and Suffolk, had developed a distinctive culture that blended Anglo-Saxon traditions with strong Scandinavian influences. The kingdom's position on the North Sea made it naturally oriented toward trade and cultural exchange with Denmark and other Scandinavian regions, creating a cosmopolitan atmosphere that would later make it particularly receptive to Christian influences from both Rome and Ireland. Mercia, centered in the Midlands, was perhaps the most strategically positioned of all the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Its location gave it access to some of the richest agricultural lands in Britain, while also positioning it to control the vital river systems that connected different regions of the country. Under ambitious kings like Penda, who would emerge as a major figure during the early 7th century, Mercia would develop into the greatest rival to West Saxon power and eventually achieve dominance over much of central England. Essex, Sussex, and the various smaller kingdoms of the southeast represented the earliest areas of Anglo-Saxon settlement and retained strong connections to the homeland regions of northern Germany and southern Denmark. These kingdoms served as crucial links in the chain of cultural and political communication that connected Anglo-Saxon England to the broader Germanic world of the early medieval period. Within this constellation of competing kingdoms, Wessex under King Ceawlin had achieved a position of particular prominence through its remarkable military successes of the 560s and 570s. The kingdom's control of the Thames Valley and the rich agricultural lands of Gloucestershire and Wiltshire provided it with the economic resources necessary to support large military forces, while its strategic position allowed it to threaten the territories of multiple neighboring kingdoms simultaneously. Yet the very success of Ceawlin's expansionist policies had also created new challenges that would test the resilience of West Saxon political institutions. The enlarged kingdom required more sophisticated governmental structures than had been necessary when Wessex was confined to its original Hampshire heartland. The integration of conquered British populations created potential sources of internal unrest that rival kingdoms might exploit. Most crucially, the aggressive expansion of West Saxon power had made enemies of neighboring kingdoms that were themselves growing in strength and ambition. The political culture that emerged in these early Anglo-Saxon kingdoms was fundamentally different from either the tribal societies from which they had evolved or the centralized imperial system they had replaced. Kingship was based on personal relationships between the ruler and his followers, rather than abstract concepts of territorial sovereignty. The king's power depended on his ability to provide his followers with opportunities for advancement through military service, generous distribution of treasure gained through successful campaigns, and effective protection against external enemies. This personal nature of political authority meant that royal courts became the focal points of political life, ways that would have been familiar to Germanic peoples but represented a significant departure from Roman administrative traditions. The Great Hall, with its central hearth and elevated throne, served not only as the king's residence but as the center of governmental act, military and ceremony. Here, surrounded by his warrior companions and advised by wise counselors, the king made the decisions that determined the fate of his kingdom. The military organization of these early kingdoms reflected their origins in the warrior cultures of Germanic Europe. Every free man was expected to bear arms in defense of his community, but the core of royal military power lay in the comitatus, or warband, a group of professional warriors who had sworn personal loyalty to the king in exchange for maintenance, equipment, and a share in the profits of successful military campaigns. These warrior companions formed not only the king's bodyguard, but also the officer corps that provided leadership for the larger militia forces that could be called up in times of major war. The economic foundations of these kingdoms rested primarily on agriculture, but this simple statement conceals considerable complexity in the actual organization of production and distribution. Most land was held by nobles who provided military service to the king in exchange for their estates, while the actual cultivation was formed by a class of free farmers who owed labor services and military obligations to their local lords. This system, which would later evolve into medieval feudalism, already showed signs of the hierarchical social organization that would characterize European society for centuries to come. Trade and craft production, while less central to the economy than agriculture, played increasingly important roles in the development of early Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The discovery of high-quality metalwork, imported pottery, and luxury goods in archaeological contexts from this period demonstrates that these societies were neither isolated nor economically primitive. Royal courts, in particular, became centers for the patronage of skilled craftsmen whose products served both practical and symbolic functions in establishing royal prestige. The legal systems that developed in these kingdoms represented a fascinating blend of Germanic customary law with practical adaptations to British conditions. The concept of vergild, monetary compensation paid to victims of violence or their families as an alternative to blood revenge, provided a mechanism for reducing the destructive cycle that could otherwise tear apart small communities. Royal law codes, when they eventually emerged, typically focused on regulating this system of compensation rather than establishing comprehensive governmental controls over social. Religious life during the late 6th century remained predominantly, though this was about to change dramatically during Ceol's lifetime. Anglo-Saxon was a complex system of beliefs centered around deities inherited from the German land, including Woden, the one-eyed god of war and wisdom, Thunor, the hammer-wielding god of thunder, and Ceol, the god of justice and war. Religious practices included seasonal festivals, ritual sacrifices, and elaborate burial ceremonies that reflected beliefs about the afterlife and the proper relationship between the living and the dead. The pagan religious calendar that governed agricultural and social activities followed the ancient rhythms of Germanic rural life, with major festivals marking the winter and summer solstices, the spring equinox, and the harvest season. These celebrations served not only religious functions, but also provided opportunities for communities to come together, resolve disputes, arrange marriages, and conduct the complex negotiations that maintained social harmony in societies without extensive formal governmental institutions. Yet even as traditional pagan practices remained dominant throughout most of Anglo-Saxon England, momentous changes were stirring in the Kingdom of Kent that would eventually transform the entire religious landscape of Britain. In 597 AD, precisely during the period of Ceol's reign in Wessex, Pope Gregory dispatched a mission led by Augustine of Canterbury to begin the systematic conversion of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to Christianity. The arrival of Augustine's mission represented more than simply a change in religious belief. It marked the beginning of a cultural revolution that would fundamentally alter Anglo-Saxon society. Christianity brought with it not only new spiritual teachings, but also Latin literacy, continental artistic styles, and administrative techniques that would gradually transform the way Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were governed and their cultures expressed. King Ethelbert of Kent, whose Queen Bertha was already a Christian, became the first Anglo-Saxon ruler to accept baptism, setting a precedent that would be followed by other kings throughout the 7th century. The conversion of royal courts created new opportunities for cultural exchange with continental Europe, while also establishing the church as a powerful new institution that could both support and challenge authority. This religious transformation was just beginning during Ceol, but its ultimate implication profound. The gradual Christianization of Anglo-Saxon England would not only change beliefs about the afterlife and proper moral behavior, but would also introduce new models of kingship based on Christian concepts of divinely sanctioned authority. The tension between older Germanic traditions of personal loyalty and warrior culture and newer Christian ideals of justice and mercy would become one of the defining themes of later Anglo-Saxon political development. As we contemplate this rich and complex world in which Ceol lived and ruled, we begin to understand that his brief reign represented far more than simply another episode in the endless cycle of early political violence. His challenge to his uncle's authority and his brief period of royal power occurred at a crucial moment when the fundamental structures of Anglo-Saxon society were being tested and transformed. The decisions made by kings like Ceol during these formative decades would help determine whether the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms could successfully adapt to changing circumstances or would fragment into insignificance under the pressure of internal conflicts and external threats. In the mead halls and training grounds of 6th century Wessex, a distinctive warrior culture flourished that would profoundly shape not only the kingdom's military effectiveness, but also its social organization, legal traditions, and concepts of honor and loyalty. This culture, rooted in the martial traditions of the Germanic homelands, but adapted to the particular conditions of post-Roman Britain, created the context within which young nobles like Ceol learned the skills and absorbed the values that would guide their actions in moments of political crisis. The foundation of Anglo-Saxon warrior culture lay in the institution of the comitatus, or personal war band, which bound individual warriors to their lord through oaths of mutual loyalty and obligation. Unlike the professional armies of the Roman Empire, which were organized along bureaucratic lines and motivated primarily by pay and promotion, the Anglo-Saxon war band was held together by personal relationships and concepts of honor that made loyalty unto death the highest virtue a warrior could display. For a young prince like Ceol, entry into his uncle's comitatus would have represented both a coming-of-age ritual and a crucial stage in his political education. The ceremony of oath-taking, conducted before witnesses in the Great Hall, with hands placed on sacred rings or weapons, created bonds that were considered inviolate under both human law and divine sanction. The warrior swore to follow his lord into battle, to share his fate in victory or defeat, and never to survive him on the battlefield if honorable death was the alternative. In return for this absolute loyalty, the lord assumed equally binding obligations to his followers. He was required to provide them with weapons, armor, and maintenance, to lead them to victory and a share in the spoils of war, and to reward faithful service with generous gifts of treasure, land, or other tokens of royalty. The relationship was personal rather than contractual, based on mutual affection and respect rather than simple economic calculation, though material considerations certainly played their part in maintaining the bonds between lord and warrior. The daily life of the royal warband revolved around the Great Hall, a massive timber structure that served simultaneously as residence, fortress, and ceremonial center. These halls, some of which could accommodate several hundred people, were marvels of Anglo-Saxon architectural achievement, with soaring roof lines supported by elaborately carved pillars, walls decorated with shields, banners, and other martial regalia that proclaimed the martial prowess of their inhabitants. The central feature of every great hall was the hearth, around which the warriors gathered for meals, storytelling, and the formal ceremonies that marked important occasions in the life of the community. Here, seated according to their rank and achievements, the members of the warband shared not only food and drink, but also the stories, songs, and ritual exchanges that maintained the cultural bonds holding their society together. The daily routine of the warband combined military training with the various duties required for the governance of the kingdom. Warriors spent their mornings practicing with weapons, sword, spear, and shield, and perfecting the coordinated movements that would be essential in battle. The afternoon might be devoted to hunting, which served both as recreation and as practical training in the skills of tracking, archery, and mounted combat that were crucial elements of Anglo-Saxon military technique. Evenings in the Great Hall followed a pattern that had been established over generations of warrior culture. The day's activities would conclude with a communal meal at which the Lord demonstrated his generosity by providing abundant food and drink for his followers. The quality and quantity of this hospitality served not only practical functions, but also symbolic ones, establishing the Lord's status and his ability to fulfill his obligations to his men. After the meal came the time for storytelling, when skilled poets would recount the deeds of legendary heroes, the genealogies of royals, and the great battles that had established the kingdom's reputation. These performances served multiple functions beyond simple entertainment. They preserved historical memory in a largely illiterate society, reinforced the values and behavioral norms of warrior culture, and provided models of heroic conduct that inspired warriors to seek glory through military service. The weapons and armor that equipped the Anglo-Saxon war were not merely tools of war, but symbols of status and identity that connected their bearers to the ancient traditions of Germanic martial culture. The sword, in particular, held special significance as the weapon of nobles and professional warriors, often passed down through generations and given personal names that reflected their history and reputation. Archaeological evidence reveals that the finest Anglo-Saxon swords were masterpieces of metalworking technique, with pattern-welded blades of extraordinary strength and beauty that required months of skilled labor to produce. Spears served as the primary weapons of both elite warriors and common soldiers, their relatively simple construction making them affordable free men of modest means, while their effectiveness in battle made indispensable elements of Anglo-Saxon military tactics. The shield, typically made of wood covered with leather and reinforced with iron fittings, completed the basic equipment of the Anglo-Saxon war, though the wealthy could afford elaborate helmets and mail shirts that provided additional protection in combat. The military tactics employed by Anglo-Saxon armies reflected both their Germanic heritage and their adaptation to British conditions. The basic formation was the shield wall, a line of warriors standing shoulder to shoulder with their shields overlapping to create an almost impenetrable barrier against enemy attacks. The effectiveness of this formation depended not only on the courage of individual warriors, but also on their discipline and coordination, qualities that could only be developed through extensive training and combat experience. Cavalry played a relatively minor role in Anglo-Saxon warfare during the 6th century, partly due to the continued importance of Roman roads that favored infantry movement, and partly because the Germanic tradition emphasized fighting on foot as the most honorable form of combat. Kings and nobles might ride to battle, but they typically dismounted to fight alongside their men, demonstrating their willingness to share the dangers they asked their followers to face. The siege warfare that had been such an important element of Roman military practice was less well developed among the Anglo-Saxons, though they proved quite capable of adapting existing technique when circumstances. The capture of Roman cities like Bath, Gloucester, and Cirencester during Ceawlin's campaign demonstrated that Anglo-Saxon armies could overcome sophisticated fortifications when properly led. Naval warfare represented another area where Anglo-Saxon military culture showed its adaptability to local conditions. While the Germanic homeland had produced skilled seafarers, the particular challenges of operating in British coastal waters required new techniques and technology that the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms gradually developed. The ship symbolism embedded in names like Ceol reflected the continuing importance of maritime Saxon culture. The legal framework that governed was based on concepts of honor and compensation that sought to channel the natural aggressiveness of military society into socially useful direction. The system of Vergil and price established monetary values for different social and provided alternatives to blood that could otherwise escalate minor disputes into devastating feuds that weakened entire kingdoms. Under this system, the killing of a required payment of compensation, not only to his family but also to his lord, who had lost a valuable follower and military asset. The amount of compensation required varied according to the social status of the victim, with kings commanding the highest prices and slaves the lowest, creating a graduated scale that reflected and reinforced the hierarchical nature of Anglo-Saxon society. The administration of justice in warrior societies required careful balance between competing demands for vengeance, compensation. Kings served as the ultimate arbiters of disputes that could not be resolved. Negotiation, but their decisions had to take into account the military and political consequences of alienating powerful nobles whose support was essential for the kingdom's defense. The role of women in Anglo-Saxon warrior culture, while often overshadowed by the male-dominated military activities that dominate our sources, was nonetheless significant in ways that would prove crucial to understanding political developments like Ceol's rise to power. Noble women served as peace weavers who cemented alliances between kingdoms through marriage, as gift givers who helped distribute royal largesse, and as keepers of family memory who preserved the genealogical traditions that legitimized claims to political authority. The institution of marriage in warrior society served multiple functions beyond the creation of family bonds, operating as a crucial mechanism for establishing and maintaining the complex network of alliances that provided stability in the volatile world of early medieval politics. Royal marriages were particularly significant, as they could transform enemies into allies, provide access to new sources of military support, and create claims to inheritance that might be pursued by future generations. Women of royal blood, like those who would have been present in Ceol's family circle, possessed their own forms of political influence that operated through different channels than the direct military leadership exercised by their male relatives. Their roles as advisors, negotiators, and guardians of family honor gave them significant influence over the decisions that shaped kingdom policy, even though this influence was often exercised behind the scenes rather than in the public forums where male political authority was displayed. The religious dimensions of warrior culture added another layer of complexity to the social relationships that governed Anglo-Saxon political life. The pagan traditions that still dominated religious practice during Ceol's lifetime included specific ritual beliefs related to war that reinforced the bonds between warriors and lords. The dedication of weapons to gods like Tew and Woden created spiritual as well as material connections between warriors and their equipment, while battlefield ritual and the treatment of enemy dead reflected beliefs about the afterlife that motivated warriors to seek glory through courageous combat. The gradual introduction of Christian influences during the late 6th century began to challenge some aspects of traditional warrior culture while reinforcing others. Christian concepts of divine kingship could strengthen royal authority by suggesting that kings ruled by God's will rather than merely through military success. But Christian teachings about mercy and forgiveness sometimes conflicted with the warrior code's emphasis on vengeance and the maintenance of honor through violence. These cultural tensions would become increasingly important as the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms developed more sophisticated governmental institutions and came into closer contact with Christian continental Europe. Kings like Ceol, ruling during the transitional period when these changes were just beginning, had to navigate between traditional expectations of warrior leadership and new models of royal authority that were slowly emerging from the fusion of Germanic and Christian traditions. The economic foundations that supported warrior culture were necessarily complex, as the maintenance of professional fighting men required substantial resources that had to be generated through a combination of agricultural surplus, tribute from conquered territories, and the profits of successful military campaigns. The redistribution of wealth through gift-giving ceremonies in the Great Hall served not only social functions but also economic ones, ensuring that the profits of royal military success were shared widely enough to maintain the loyalty of the nobles, whose support was essential for continued success. The seasonal rhythm of military campaigning followed patterns that were determined as much by agricultural necessity as by strategic considerations. Spring and summer campaigns could take advantage of better weather, longer days, while also providing opportunities to disrupt enemy agricultural activities at crucial times. Growing season. The autumn harvest season typically brought a pause in major military operations, as both armies and their supporting populations focused on gathering the crops that would sustain them through the winter months. Winter warfare, while not impossible, required different tactics and logistics than the major campaigns of the warmer months. The shortened days and harsh weather of the Anglo-Saxon winter created opportunities for surprise attacks and raids that could be devastatingly effective against unprepared enemies. But they also posed significant risks for attackers who might find themselves trapped by storms or forced to retreat across hostile territory without adequate supply. The intelligence networks that supported military operations in this period relied heavily on the personal relationships that connected noble families across kingdom boundaries. Information about enemy preparation, political developments, and military movements traveled along the same social channels that carried news about marriages, deaths, and other family matters, creating a communication that could be both remarkably efficient and frustratingly unreliable. As we contemplate the warrior culture that shaped Ceol's development from prince to king, we begin to understand that his challenge to his uncle's authority was not simply a personal dispute, but part of a larger struggle over competing visions of how warrior society should adapt to changing circumstances. The traditional values of loyalty, honor, and military excellence remained central to Anglo-Saxon political culture, but their application to specific situations required constant negotiation and reinterpretation as new challenges emerged and old certainties were called into question. The Great Hall, where Ceol learned the arts of war and statecraft, would have echoed with discussions of these fundamental questions as nobles, warriors, and wise counselors debated the proper response to military setbacks, political challenges, and the gradual transformation of Anglo-Saxon society through contact with Christian civilization. In these conversations conducted around the central hearth that symbolized the unity and continuity of the warrior community, the future king absorbed not only tactical knowledge and political wisdom, but also the cultural values that would guide his actions during his brief but significant reign. Beyond the grand narratives of kings and battles that dominate our historical sources, the true foundation of Anglo-Saxon civilization lay in the quiet rhythms of daily life that governed the existence of thousands of ordinary throughout the kingdom of Wessex. To understand the world that Ceol ruled, we must descend from the royal halls to the humble farmsteads, village workshops, and rural churches, where most of his subjects lived out their lives in patterns that had evolved over generations of adaptation to the particular conditions of post-Roman. The vast majority of West Saxons during the late 6th century lived in small agricultural communities scattered across the rolling chalklands and river valleys that characterized the kingdom's landscape. These settlements, typically consisting of no more than a few dozen people, were organized around the fundamental unit of Anglo-Saxon rural society, the family farm or tun, which provided both the economic foundation and the social framework. The typical Anglo-Saxon farmstead was a carefully planned complex of buildings arranged around a central yard or green space that served multiple functions as a work area, gathering place, and defensive position in times of danger. The main dwelling, usually a rectangular timber structure with walls of woven branches, plastered with clay and dung, contained a single large room that served as kitchen, living area, and sleeping quarters for the entire family. The central hearth, constructed of stone or clay and positioned beneath a hole in the thatched roof, provided heat, light, and a cooking fire that remained burning throughout the day and much of the night. Around this central dwelling clustered a variety of outbuildings that reflected the diverse activities necessary for agricultural self-sufficiency. The barn, often the largest structure on the farm, stored the grain harvest that represented the community's primary source of food. Separate buildings housed livestock during the winter months, while workshops provided covered spaces for the various crafts, metalwork, textile production, leather preparation, and wood that supplied the tools, clothing, and equipment needed for rural life. The agricultural techniques employed by Anglo-Saxon farmers combined innovations developed through centuries of Germanic experience with adaptations to British soil and climate conditions. The basic tool of cultivation remained the simple wooden plow, often reinforced with iron cutting edges, which was pulled by teams of oxen across fields that were typically organized in long, narrow strips that maximized the efficiency of turning the heavy plow at the end of each furrow. Crop rotation followed patterns that reflected both practical, agricultural knowledge and supernatural beliefs about the proper relationship between human activity and natural forces. The three-field system, which would later become standard throughout medieval Europe, was already emerging in some areas, with one field planted in winter wheat or rye, another in spring crops like barley or oats, and the third left fallow to recover its fertility through natural processes and the grazing of livestock. The seasonal rhythm of agricultural life created a calendar of activities that governed not only individual families, but entire communities, as certain tasks required cooperative labor that brought neighbors together in bonds of mutual obligation and assistance. Spring plowing, summer haying, and autumn harvest were community enterprises that reinforced social relationships while accomplishing the essential work of production. Livestock played crucial role in Anglo-Saxon agricultural systems, providing not only meat, milk, and leather, but also the draft power necessary for cultivation and transportation. Cattle were the most valuable animals, serving as measures of wealth and status, as well as sources of food and labor. Sheep provided wool for textile production, while pigs could forage in woodlands that were unsuitable for other forms of agriculture. Horses, though less common than oxen for draft work, were prized for transportation and as symbols of high social status. The diet of ordinary Anglo-Saxons was based primarily on bread made from wheat, barley, or rye, supplemented by vegetables grown in small gardens attached to individual farmsteads. Cabbage, onion, leeks, beans, and peas provided essential nutrients and could be preserved through various techniques that allowed communities to survive the lean months of late winter and early spring when stored grain supplies ran. Meat was a luxury for most people, consumed primarily during festivals and special occasions when animals were slaughtered for community feasts. Fish from rivers and coastal waters provided protein that was more regularly, while wild game hunted in the forests and marshlands added variety to the diet of those who possessed the skills and legal rights necessary for hunting. Brewing and food preservation were essential skills that required considerable knowledge of traditional technique passed down through generations of rural experience. Ale, brewed from barley or other grains, served not only as a source of nutrition, but also as a safer alternative to water that might be contaminated by poor sanitation. The process of brewing created opportunities for social interaction as neighbors shared knowledge, equipment, and labor in the production of this essential commodity. The textile production that provided clothing and household goods for Anglo-Saxon families was primarily women's work, though it required the cooperation of entire communities in the production of raw materials and the complex processes that transformed plant and animal fibers into finished cloth. Flax cultivation and processing for linen production required coordinated community effort, while sheep raising for wool involved decisions about grazing rights and seasonal movement of animals that affected entire villages. The actual work of spinning thread and weaving cloth took place primarily during the winter months when agricultural demands were reduced, creating opportunities for the social interaction that accompanied communal work sessions in the heated spaces of individual dwellings. These gatherings served multiple functions beyond simple craft production, providing opportunities for storytelling, courtship, and the informal exchange of information that maintained social bonds across extended family networks. Metalworking, though requiring specialized skills and equipment, was practiced at the local level to meet the basic needs of agricultural communities for tool, weapon, and household implement. Village smiths worked iron ore obtained through trade or local extraction to produce the plowshares, axes, knives, and other metal goods that were essential for rural life, but too valuable and complex to be imported from distant sources. The legal and social organization of Anglo-Saxon rural communities was based on concepts of kinship and mutual obligation that created networks of support and protection extending far beyond individual nuclear families. The extended family group, or kindred, assumed responsibility for the actions of its members and provided assistance during times of crisis, creating a social safety net that helped communities survive the various disasters: crop failure, livestock disease, military raids that periodically threatened rural settlements. Local governance was exercised through assemblies of free men who gathered regularly to resolve disputes, make decisions about common resources, and coordinate community responses to external challenges. These moots, as they were called, operated according to traditional procedures that emphasized consensus building rather than majority, seeking solutions that would maintain community harmony rather than simply prevailing in factional conflicts. The position of women in Anglo-Saxon rural society was complex, involving both significant responsibilities and clear limitations that reflected the gender roles established by Germanic tradition and adapted to British conditions. Women controlled household production and managed the domestic economy that provided families with food, clothing, and other necessities, while also serving as keepers of family memory and tradition through their roles in child rearing and social ceremony. Marriage customs combined romantic choice with practical considerations of economic compatibility and social advantage, creating unions that served both emotional and strategic functions in the complicated web of relationships that held rural communities together. Wedding ceremonies followed traditional patterns that emphasized the transfer of economic rights and social obligations, along with the creation of emotional bonds between individuals and their families. Religious life during the late 6th century remained predominantly pagan, though this was beginning to change as Christian influences gradually penetrated even remote areas. Traditional Germanic beliefs and practices continued to govern the seasonal festivals that marked important transitions in the agricultural year: the spring planting ceremonies, midsummer celebrations, harvest festivals, and winter solstice observances that connected human communities to the natural cycles that governed their survival. These religious observances were typically community affairs that brought together families from scattered farmsteads for celebrations that combined ritual activities with social interaction, economic exchange, and political decision-making. Sacred groves, springs, and ancient burial sites served as gathering places where traditional ceremonies reinforced both spiritual beliefs and social bonds that held rural communities together across the challenges of geographical isolation and seasonal hardship. The gradual introduction of Christian teachings during Ceol's lifetime created new opportunities for religious expression, while also challenging some aspects of traditional belief and practice. Christian concepts of individual salvation and universal brotherhood sometimes conflicted with older Germanic emphasis on kinship, loyalty, and tribal identity, creating tensions that would require generations to resolve fully. Local religious leaders, whether pagan priests maintaining traditional ceremony or Christian missionaries introducing new teachings, served crucial roles in maintaining community cohesion through their function as intermediaries between human society and divine authority. Their presence at important ceremonies, births, marriages, deaths, seasonal festivals, provided continuity and legitimacy for the social institutions that governed rural life. The educational systems that transmitted knowledge across generations operated primarily through oral tradition and practical demonstration rather than formal schooling or written instruction. Children learned the skills they would need as adults through participation in family and community activities, acquiring not only technical knowledge but also the social attitudes and cultural values that maintained community stability. Storytelling served particularly important functions in preserving historical memory and cultural identity in societies that remained largely illiterate. Despite increasing contact with Christian civilization and its emphasis on written learning, the long winter evenings provided natural opportunities for the recitation of traditional tales that entertained listeners while also transmitting important information about family genealogies, legal precedents, and moral values. As we contemplate this rich tapestry of rural life that provided the foundation for Anglo-Saxon civilization, we begin to understand that kings like Ceol ruled not simply through military force and political cunning, but through their ability to maintain the complex social relationships that held their kingdoms together. The success or failure of royal policies depended ultimately on their impact on the daily lives of ordinary people whose loyalty and support provided the resources necessary for political and military success. The seasonal rhythms of agricultural life, the social bonds of kinship and community, the religious ceremonies that connected human activity to divine authority, and the economic relationships that distributed resources according to traditional patterns of obligation and exchange. All of these elements of rural civilization created the context within which royal authority operated and the standards by which royal performance was ultimately judged. In the mists of an early morning in 592 AD, as the first light of dawn crept across the ancient earthworks of Wodnesbeorg, what we know today as Adam's Grave near Marlborough, Wiltshire, two armies faced each other in a confrontation that would forever alter the destiny of the Kingdom of Wessex. This battle, though remembered only briefly in the sparse entries of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, represented one of those pivotal moments in history when personal ambition intersects with broader political forces to create irreversible change in the fabric of a civilization. The location chosen for this decisive encounter was itself rich with symbolic significance that would not have been lost on the warriors who gathered on that fateful Wodnesbeorg, meaning Woden's barrow, was an ancient Neolithic long barrow that had served for millennia as a sacred site where the living could commune with their ancestors and seek divine guidance for momentous decisions. The choice to fight at this location elevated the conflict beyond a simple political dispute into a sacred trial by combat, where the gods themselves would determine the rightful of the West Saxon. The earthwork occupied a commanding position overlooking Pusey, its elevated location providing both strategic military advantages and spiritual authority that made it an appropriate venue for resolving dispute that could not be settled through political processes. The ancient burial mound, constructed by Britain's prehistoric inhabitants centuries before the arrival of either Romans or Anglo-Saxons, had become integrated into Germanic religious traditions as a place where Woden, the one-eyed god of war and wisdom, was believed to hold court among the honored dead. The months leading up to this confrontation had been marked by increasingly open tensions between King Ceawlin and his nephew Ceol, as political opinion throughout Wessex gradually polarized around these two representatives of competing visions for the kingdom's future. Ceawlin, now in his 70s and having ruled for over 3 decades, represented continuity with the aggressive expansionist policies that had made Wessex the dominant power in southern England, but had recently suffered significant military setbacks that called into question his continued effectiveness as a war leader. Ceol, by contrast, represented the promise of new leadership that might be better adapted to the changed circumstances facing Wessex in the late 6th century. His youth, energy, and fresh perspective appealed to nobles who had grown concerned about the kingdom's recent military reverses and the increasing challenges posed by rival powers like Mercia and Northumbria. His royal blood and position within the established dynastic structure provided legitimacy for what might otherwise have appeared to be simple rebellion against lawful authority. The process by which these political tensions escalated into open military confrontation remains largely hidden from us by the limitations of our sources, but we can imagine the careful negotiations, secret meetings, and gradual alignment of noble family that preceded the dramatic events at Wodnesbeorg. In a society where political authority depended on personal loyalty and military effectiveness, the decision to support one claimant over another required careful calculation of the likely consequences for family fortunes and kingdom security. Noble families throughout Wessex, would have found themselves forced to choose between conflicting loyalties as the dispute between Ceol and nephew intensified. Some, bound by long-standing ties of gratitude and obligation to King Ceawlin, remained faithful to the established order, despite growing concerns about his recent failures. Others, convinced that new leadership was necessary for the kingdom's survival, began to coalesce around Ceol as the most viable alternative to continued rule by an aging and apparently failing monarch. The military forces that gathered Wodnesbeorg on that spring in 592 represented not just two armies, but two different approaches to Anglo-Saxon war political organization. Ceawlin's forces likely included the core of the traditional veteran warriors who had served him faithfully through decades of successful campaigns and who remained bound to him by personal oaths and ties of honor that transcended immediate political calculations. These experienced fighters brought to the battle not only superior military skills developed through years of combat, but also the psychological advantages that came from fighting under a proven commander whose tactical genius had won countless previous victories. Their equipment, pattern-welded swords, iron-reinforced shields, and mail shirts that represented enormous investments of skilled labor and precious materials, testified to their elite status and the resources that Ceawlin had lavished on maintaining their Ceol's supporters, while perhaps less experienced in large-scale warfare, possessed their own advantages that would prove crucial in the coming confrontation. Their conviction that they were fighting for necessary change rather than simply defending an increasingly inadequate status quo provided powerful motivation that could compensate for any deficiencies in training or equipment. Their cause attracted support from nobles who controlled significant military resources throughout the kingdom, creating a coalition that could potentially overwhelm the forces through superior numbers, if not superior skill. The tactical situation at Wodnesbeorg favored neither side decisively, as the elevated position of the ancient barrow could be exploited by whichever force succeeded in occupying it first, while the surrounding terrain offered opportunities for both mounted and infantry tactics that played to the strengths of Anglo-Saxon military organization. The relatively open nature of the landscape meant that the battle would likely be decided by direct confrontation between the opposing shield walls, rather than through the kind of siege war or guerrilla tactics that might have favored one side over the other. As the two armies deployed in the pre-dawn darkness, following time-honored rituals that prepared warriors mentally and spiritually for the ordeal ahead, the significance of the moment would have been apparent to every participant. This was not simply another raid or border skirmish, but a decisive encounter that would determine the future direction of one of the most powerful kingdoms in Britain. The outcome would establish not only who would rule Wessex, but what kind of kingdom it would become under new leadership. The battle itself, when it finally commenced with the rising of the sun, appears to have been brief but decisive, though the specific tactical details that determined its outcome remain lost to us. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records only that there was great slaughter and that Ceawlin was driven out, suggesting a complete collapse of royal resistance rather than the kind of prolonged, evenly matched combat that characterized many Anglo-Saxon battles. This rapid resolution of what might have been expected to be a closely contested encounter suggests that political factors may have been as important as purely military in determining the outcome. The defection of key noble supporters at crucial moments in the battle could have created cascading failures that turned what began as an evenly matched confrontation into a rout that left Ceawlin's forces in complete disarray. The psychological impact of fighting at a sacred site like Wodnesbeorg may also have influenced the battle's outcome, as warriors on both sides would have been acutely aware that the gods were watching and judging their performance. Signs and portents that might have seemed insignificant under normal circumstances could have assumed decisive importance in such a charged atmosphere, creating momentum shifts that determined the final result through their impact on war and confidence. The aftermath of the battle saw the immediate transformation of Wessex's political landscape, as Ceol's victory eliminated not only King Ceawlin, but also the entire network of supporters who had remained loyal to the old regime. The Great Slaughter, mentioned in the chronicle, likely included many of the veteran warriors who had formed the core of Ceawlin's military strength, creating a power vacuum that Ceol needed to fill with his own supporters if he hoped to establish stable control over the kingdom. The fate of Ceawlin himself illustrates the harsh realities of Anglo-Saxon political failure, as his defeat at Wodnesbeorg led not to honorable retirement or comfortable exile, but to complete expulsion from the kingdom he had for over 3 decades. The former king, stripped of his royal dignity and separated from the followers who had given meaning to his life, became a wandering exile whose continued existence posed a potential threat to the new regime's legitimacy. The year following the battle saw the systematic elimination of potential rivals as Ceol consolidated his control over the kingdom through a combination of political maneuvering and selective violence. The deaths of Ceawlin in 593 and of 2 other royal kinsmen, Ceolin and Creda, removed the most obvious alternative claimants to the throne, while also serving as warnings to other nobles who might be tempted to challenge the new king's authority. This process of political consolidation, while necessary for establishing stable government, also created new challenges for the kingdom, as the elimination of experienced political military leaders left gaps in the governmental structure that would take time to fill adequately. The fragmentation of authority into local power bases that characterized Ceol's early reflected not only the natural tendency of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms toward decentralization, but also the specific disruptions caused by the violent change of dynasty. The strategic implications of Ceawlin's fall extended far beyond Wessex itself, as neighboring kingdoms quickly moved to exploit the apparent weakness created by internal political upheaval. The loss of tributary relationships and territorial control had been built up over decades of successful military campaigning created opportunities for rival powers to advance their own territorial ambitions at West Saxon expense. Yet even as Ceol struggled to establish effective control over his inheritance, the very success of his challenge to established authority demonstrated the continued vitality of Anglo-Saxon political institutions and their capacity for adaptation to changing circumstances. The transfer of power through military confrontation, while violent and destructive, also provided a mechanism for ensuring that leadership remained in the hands of those capable of meeting the challenges facing their kingdoms. As we contemplate the morning mists that shrouded Wodnesbeorg on that decisive day in 592, we can almost hear the clash of iron on iron and the shouts of warriors whose courage and determination would reshape the political landscape of early medieval England. The battle fought at this ancient sacred site marked not only the end of one reign and the beginning of another, but also a crucial test of the resilience and adaptability that would enable the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to survive and prosper through centuries of internal change and external challenge. The grass that now grows peacefully over Adam's grave covers ground that once ran red with the blood of warriors, whose sacrifice purchased the political stability that would allow their descendants to build one of the most successful civilizations in medieval Europe. Their memory, preserved in the brief but evocative entries of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, reminds us that the grand narratives of historical development often depend on individual moments of courage, ambition, and determination that can seem almost random in their occurrence, but prove decisive in their consequences for the future of entire civilizations. The crown that Ceol claimed through victory at Wodnesbeorg came with challenges that would test every aspect of his political skill and understanding of Anglo-Saxon governance. The kingdom he inherited in 592 was not the unified, confident realm that his uncle had ruled at the height of West Saxon power, but a fractured polity where royal authority had been severely weakened by military defeat, internal conflict, and the systematic elimination of experienced political leaders who had provided stability and continuity for over 3 decades. The immediate aftermath of Ceol's victory required delicate navigation between the competing demands of rewarding supporters, intimidating potential opponents, and maintaining sufficient continuity with established governmental practices to prevent the complete collapse of royal administration. The new king faced the classic dilemma of successful rebels throughout history: how to transform military victory into legitimate political authority that could command the loyalty and obedience necessary for effective governance. The Anglo-Saxon concept of kingship that Ceol inherited was fundamentally personal in nature, based on direct relationships between the ruler and his followers, rather than abstract notions of territorial sovereignty or bureaucratic administration. The king's authority depended on his ability to provide military leadership, distribute wealth and honors fairly among his supporters, and maintain the complex web of personal loyalties that held the kingdom together against internal divisions and external threats. This personal nature of royal power created both opportunities and vulnerabilities for a new king like Ceol, whose claim to the throne rested primarily on military success rather than the kind of gradual succession that allowed for smooth transitions of authority. His supporters expected immediate rewards for their loyalty and service, but excessive generosity toward new allies might alienate established noble families whose cooperation was essential for maintaining administrative continuity and territorial control. The geographical challenges facing the new king were particularly acute given the disruptions caused by the recent civil conflict and the ongoing military pressures from neighboring kingdoms that viewed Wessex's internal troubles as opportunities for territorial expansion. The kingdom's extended frontiers, stretching from the Thames Valley in the north to the English Channel in the south, required constant attention from royal forces that had been depleted by the losses suffered at Wodnesbeorg and subsequent political purges. The process of establishing new governmental relationships began immediately after Ceol's victory, as surviving noble families throughout the kingdom made the crucial decisions that would determine their future status under the new regime. Some, recognizing the futility of continued resistance, sought to make peace with the victorious faction through formal submissions that acknowledged Ceol's royal authority in exchange for confirmation of their existing estates and privileges. Others, whether through loyalty to the fallen king, concern about their position under new leadership, or simple miscalculation of the political situation, chose to resist the new regime through various forms of passive and active opposition. This resistance created ongoing security challenges that required military attention and political resources that Ceol could ill afford given the other pressures facing his kingdom. The royal household that Ceol established after his victory reflected both the practical necessities of governing a complex kingdom and the symbolic requirements of establishing legitimate rule. The great hall that served as the center of governmental activity needed to project an image of power and prosperity that would convince both subjects and foreign observers that the new regime possessed the strength and permanence necessary for effective leadership. The composition of the Royal Council, or Witenagemot, that advised the king on matters of policy and administration, required careful balance between competing factions and interests within the nobility. Ceol needed counselors who possessed the experience and knowledge necessary for effective governance, but he also needed to ensure that his advisors remained loyal to his regime rather than becoming focal points for opposition movements that could threaten royal authority. The military organization that had brought Ceol to power required transformation from a revolutionary force focused on overthrowing the existing order into a royal army capable of defending the kingdom against external enemies while maintaining internal peace and stability. This transformation involved not only changes in command structure and tactical organization, but also shifts in the psychological groups that had been united primarily by opposition to the previous regime. The integration of former opponents into the new governmental structure posed particularly complex challenges that required both political skill and careful attention to the personal honor code that governed Anglo-Saxon noble behavior. Warriors who had fought against Ceol at Wodnesbeorg could potentially become valuable supporters if their submission was handled in ways that preserved their dignity and provided opportunities for honorable service under the new regime. The economic foundations of royal power required immediate attention as Ceol sought to establish the fiscal resources necessary for maintaining his expanded household, rewarding supporters, and funding the military activities that remained essential for kingdom security. The tribute payments and territorial revenue that had supported Ceolin's regime needed to be renegotiated and, in many cases, enforced through renewed displays of royal military power. The relationship between the new king and the church represented another area where careful political management was required, even though the Christianization of Wessex would not occur for several decades. The pagan religious institutions and ceremony that provided spiritual legitimacy for royal authority needed to be maintained and properly supported, while the traditional priest kings and wise women who served as intermediaries between human society and divine power required careful cultivation as potential sources of support for the new regime. The seasonal rhythms of Anglo-Saxon governmental activity meant that Ceol's first year as king included the crucial autumn and winter months when royal courts typically focused on internal administrative matters and the resolution of legal disputes that had accumulated during the campaigning season. These activities provided opportunities for the new king to demonstrate his wisdom and justice in ways that could build long-term support among the broader population of free farmers and craftsmen whose loyalty ultimately determined the kingdom's stability. The legal traditions that governed Anglo-Saxon society required special attention from a king whose own rise to power had involved what might be characterized as violations of established succession customs. Ceol needed to present his assumption of royal authority as consistent with traditional law and custom, while also establishing precedents that would legitimize his particular path to power and provide security for his own eventual succession arrangements. The management of royal estates throughout the kingdom provided another mechanism through which Ceol could demonstrate effective governance while also rewarding supporters and building new networks of personal loyalty. The appointment of estate managers, the negotiation of agricultural contracts, and the administration of justice in rural areas all provided opportunities for political patronage that could strengthen royal authority if handled skillfully. The military challenges that continued to face Wessex during Ceol's reign required ongoing attention, despite the king's apparent preference for focusing on internal consolidation rather than external expansion. border defense, the maintenance of fortifications, and the organization of local militia forces all demanded royal resources and attention even during periods of relative peace with neighboring kingdoms. The diplomatic relationships that Ceawlin had established with other Anglo-Saxon rulers needed careful renegotiation as neighboring kings tested the strength and commitment of the new West Saxon regime. Some of these relationships could be maintained through demonstrations of continued military capability, while others might require new agreements that reflected the changed balance of power created by Wessex's recent internal troubles. The cultural activities that provided legitimacy and prestige for royal courts, the patronage of skilled craftsmen, the support of poets and storytellers, and the maintenance of traditional ceremonies and festivals required ongoing attention despite the pressing practical demands of governmental administration. These activities helped establish Ceol's regime as worthy successors to the glorious tradition of West Saxon kingship, while also providing opportunities for building personal relationships with influential members of the cultural. The development of legal mechanisms for handling disputes and conflicts that arose from the recent political upheavals required particular attention to questions of property right, inheritance claims, and the status of families whose members had supported different sides during the succession crisis. The establishment of clear precedents for resolving these issues fairly and consistently was essential for building confidence in the new regime's commitment to justice and stability. As Ceol's first year as king progressed through the familiar seasonal cycle, Anglo-Saxon political life, the initial challenges of establishing royal authority gradually gave way to the ongoing responsibilities of effective governance that would define his reign. The foundations laid in this crucial period of consolidation would determine whether his victory at Wodnesbeorg represented the beginning of a stable new era in West Saxon history, or merely another episode in the cycle of political violence that could ultimately destroy the kingdom's capacity for effective self-governance. The quiet months of winter planning and spring preparation that characterized Ceol's approach to kingship during these early years reflected a mature understanding of the political realities facing his kingdom and a commitment to rebuilding royal through patient attention to the practical details of governmental administration, rather than the dramatic military gestures that had characterized his uncle's aggressive approach to royal. The Wessex that Ceol, after his victory at Wodnesbeorg, bore little resemblance to the unified and confident kingdom that had dominated southern England under his uncle's aggressive lead. The civil war that brought him to power had shattered the complex network of personal relationships and institutional arrangements that provided stability and effectiveness to Anglo-Saxon governance. Creating a political landscape was constantly challenged by local power centers that operated with increasing independence from central control. The fragmentation of governmental authority that characterized Ceol's early reign was not simply the result of temporary disruption caused by the succession crisis, but reflected deeper structural problems that had been developing throughout the later of Ceawlin's rule, as the expanded kingdom proved increasingly difficult to govern through the traditional mechanisms of personal kingship. The territorial gains that had made Wessex a dominant regional power had also created administrative challenges that stretched beyond the capacity of 6th century governmental institutions to manage effectively. The most immediate manifestation of this governmental crisis was the emergence of what the sources describe as local power bases throughout the kingdom, where individual nobles or groups of allied families established semi-independent authority that acknowledged Ceol's kingship in theory while operating with practical autonomy in their own territories. This development represented a significant retreat from the centralized control that had characterized the most successful periods of West Saxon expansion and created ongoing challenges for royal attempts to coordinate military, economic, and legal activities across the kingdom's extended territories. The Upper Thames Valley, which had traditionally served as the heartland of West Saxon royal power, remained under Ceol's direct control and provided the territorial base from which he attempted to reassert royal authority over more distant regions of the kingdom. This core area included not only the richest agricultural lands and most important strategic positions, but also the established royal estates and administrative centers that provided the material foundations for effective kingship. The concentration of royal power in this traditional heartland reflected both practical necessities and strategic calculations, as Ceol recognized that attempting to maintain direct control over the kingdom's full territorial extent would likely result in the complete collapse of royal authority, rather than the gradual restoration of centralized governance that remained his ultimate objective. By focusing his limited resources on securing a stable base of operations, he hoped to create the conditions for eventual expansion of royal control into regions that had temporarily slipped beyond direct governmental oversight. The relationship between the royal court and these semi-autonomous local power centers required constant diplomatic attention, as Ceol sought to maintain the personal relationships that provided the only effective mechanism for coordinating activities across the fragmented kingdom. The traditional ceremonies and social rituals that reinforced bonds between the king and his nobles assumed crucial importance during this period, as formal expressions of loyalty and submission provided psychological compensation for the practical limitations on royal. The seasonal gatherings that brought nobles from throughout the kingdom to the royal court served multiple functions beyond simple ceremonial display, providing opportunities for political negotiation, information exchange, and the careful management of competing interests that might otherwise escalate into open conflict. These assemblies required delicate orchestration to ensure that they reinforced rather than undermined royal prestige, while also addressing the practical concerns of noble families whose cooperation remained essential for kingdom stability. The military implications of governmental fragmentation posed particularly serious challenges for a kingdom that faced ongoing external threats from neighboring powers who viewed Wessex's internal troubles as opportunities for territorial expansion. The royal warband that had traditionally served as the core of West Saxon military strength had been decimated by the losses suffered at Wodnesbeorg and the subsequent political purges, while the local militias that provided the bulk of the kingdom's defensive capability were now under the control of semi-autonomous nobles whose loyalty to the crown could not be taken for granted in moments of crisis. The defensive arrangements that Ceol established during his early years as king reflected this new reality of decentralized military power, relying more heavily on negotiated agreements with local strongmen than on direct royal command of unified military forces. This system, while less efficient than the centralized military organization that had characterized Ceolin's most successful campaign, provided greater flexibility in responding to localized threats, while also reducing the risk that military failures might trigger broader political upheavals. The economic consequences of political fragmentation created additional challenges for royal attempts to maintain the fiscal resources necessary for effective governance. The tribute payments and territorial revenue that had supported the expanded royal household under Ceolin's rule were disrupted by the reduced effectiveness of royal authority in distant regions, while the costs of maintaining loyal support through generous gift-giving remained as high as ever. The royal treasury that had been built up through decades of successful military campaigns was rapidly depleted by the combination of reduced income and increased expenditure that characterized the immediate aftermath of the succession crisis. This fiscal pressure forced Ceol to make difficult choices between competing demands for royal patronage, while also seeking new sources of revenue that could support the restoration of effective governmental authority. The legal challenges that arose from the recent political upheavals required careful attention to questions of justice and precedent that could either strengthen or further undermine, depending on how they were handled. The property disputes, inheritance claims, and criminal accusations that emerged from the succession crisis needed to be resolved, that demonstrated royal commitment to fair and consistent application of traditional, while also recognize a political reality created by the changed balance of power within the kingdom. The establishment of royal courts that could command respect and obedience throughout the fragmented kingdom required not only demonstrations of legal wisdom, but also careful attention to the symbolic aspects of judicial authority that convinced participants that royal decisions carried divine sanction as well as human wisdom. The traditional legal ceremonies and ritual procedures that surrounded the administration of justice assumed particular importance during this period of weakened royal power. The religious dimensions of political crisis added another layer of complexity to Ceol's efforts to restore stable governance, as the pagan religious institution that provided spiritual legitimacy for royal authority had been disrupted by the violence and disruption of the succession crisis. The sacred sites, seasonal festivals, and ritual relationships that connected human society to divine authority required careful restoration and proper maintenance if they were to continue providing the spiritual foundations for political stability. The role of traditional religious leaders, priest kings, wise women, and ritual specialists in legitimizing the new regime required delicate negotiation, as these figures possessed independent sources of authority that could either support or challenge royal power, depending on their assessment of Ceol's spiritual qualifications for kingship. The performance of proper religious observances and the maintenance of traditional sacred obligations became crucial elements in establishing royal legitimacy that extended beyond simple military success. The cultural activities that provided prestige and legitimacy for royal courts faced particular challenges during this period of reduced resources and political instability. The patronage of skilled craftsmen, the support of poets and storytellers, and the maintenance of the elaborate social rituals that reinforced royal status all required ongoing investment of time and treasure that competed with more pressing demands for governmental attention and resources. Yet these cultural investments remained essential for building long-term support, as they demonstrated royal commitment to maintaining the traditional values and institutions that provided meaning and identity for Anglo-Saxon society. The great feasts, gift-giving ceremonies, and artistic displays that characterized royal courts served not only entertainment functions, but also crucial political purposes in building personal relationships and demonstrating royal capacity for effective leadership. The management of relationships with neighboring kingdoms required ongoing diplomatic attention, as rival rulers tested the strength and commitment of the new West Saxon regime through various forms of pressure and provocation. The tributary relationships and alliance agreements that Ceolian had established through military success needed to be renegotiated from a position of relative weakness, while new threats emerged from kingdoms that had previously been deterred by West Saxon military power. The diplomatic correspondence and formal negotiations that characterized Anglo-Saxon international relations during this period required careful balance between acknowledging the changed circumstances facing Wessex and maintaining sufficient royal dignity to preserve the kingdom's status as a major regional power. The ceremonial exchanges, hostage arrangements, and marriage negotiations that provided mechanisms for peaceful resolution of international disputes assumed particular importance during a period when military solutions were less readily available. The seasonal rhythms of Anglo-Saxon provided structure for Ceol's efforts to read through the careful orchestration of traditional governmental activity. The spring assembly planned military camp, the summer progresses that demonstrated royal presence throughout the kingdom, the autumn courts that resolved legal disputes, and the winter planning sessions that prepared for the following year, all provided opportunities for gradual restoration of centralized control. The patient approach to governmental restoration that characterized Ceol's kingship reflected a mature understanding of the qualities facing his regime and a commitment to building sustainable institutions rather than pursuing dramatic gestures that might provide short-term success at the cost of long-term stability. This methodical approach to royal administration, while less spectacular than the aggressive expansionism that had characterized his uncle's reign, proved better adapted to the changed circumstances facing Wessex in the late 6th century. The network of personal relationships that Ceol carefully constructed during his years as king created new forms of political stability that proved more resilient than the military-based authority that had characterized earlier periods of West Saxon dominance. The emphasis on negotiation, compromise, and gradual consensus building that marked his approach to governance established precedents that would influence Anglo-Saxon political development for generations to come. The local institutions that emerged during this period of decentralized authority, district assemblies, regional military commands, and autonomous noble courts, created new mechanisms for governmental coordination that supplemented rather than replaced traditional royal authority. These innovations, while born of necessity during a period of political crisis, proved valuable additions to the toolkit of Anglo-Saxon statecraft that enhanced rather than diminished the effectiveness of later royal administrations. As Ceol's reign progressed through its brief but significant duration, the foundations laid during this period of careful political reconstruction would provide the stability and institutional capacity that enabled his successors to restore Wessex to its position as a major regional power. The patient work of rebuilding governmental authority through attention to practical details and personal relationships, while less dramatic than the military conquests that had originally established West Saxon dominance, proved equally important for the long-term development of Anglo-Saxon political institutions. Even as Ceol struggled to consolidate his authority over a fractured Wessex, momentous changes were beginning to unfold in distant Kent that would eventually transform the entire religious and cultural landscape of Anglo-Saxon England. The year 597 AD, which marked the final year of Ceol's brief reign, witnessed the arrival of Augustine's mission and the first successful attempt to establish Christianity as a royal religion among the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, developments that would ultimately prove more significant for the future of English civilization than any of the political and military conflicts that dominated contemporary attention. The mission that Pope Gregory the Great dispatched to Britain in 596 AD represented the culmination of decades of papal interest in extending Christian influence into the Germanic kingdoms that had emerged from the collapse of the Western Rome. Gregory's decision to focus missionary efforts on Britain reflected both practical considerations about the opportunities available and deeper theological commitments to spreading Christian teaching among peoples who had previously remained outside the sphere of Roman ecclesiastical authority. The choice of Augustine, prior of the monastery of St. Andrew in Rome, to lead this ambitious missionary enterprise demonstrated the high priority that Gregory attached to the British mission and his confidence that the conversion of Anglo-Saxon rulers could be accomplished through the combination of careful diplomacy, theological persuasion, and practical demonstration of Christian civilization's advantages over traditional pagan culture. The landing of Augustine's party in Kent during 597 AD occurred at a particularly auspicious moment in Anglo-Saxon political development, as King Ethelbert of Kent had recently established himself as one of the most powerful and prestigious rulers in Britain through successful military campaigns and skillful diplomatic maneuvering. His marriage to Bertha, a Frankish princess who was already a Christian, had created conditions that were particularly favorable for the introduction of Christian teaching into the highest levels of Anglo-Saxon society. The court of King Ethelbert that received Augustine's mission represented the most sophisticated and cosmopolitan political environment in late 6th century Britain, with extensive trade connections to continental Europe and cultural influences that reflected the kingdom's strategic position across the English Channel from Frankish Gaul. The wealth and artistic achievement evident in Kentish archaeological remains from this period testified to the kingdom's prosperity and its openness to foreign ideas and innovations. The initial success of Augustine's mission in converting King Ethelbert and establishing the first Anglo-Saxon Christian church at Canterbury created a powerful precedent that would influence religious development throughout Britain for centuries to come. The demonstration that Anglo-Saxon rulers could adopt Christianity without losing their political effectiveness or cultural identity encouraged other kings to consider similar conversions, while also providing practical models for how Christian institutions could be integrated into existing governmental structures. The theological and cultural challenges that confronted Augustine's mission reflected the fundamental differences between Christian and pagan worldview that had developed over centuries of separate evolution. Anglo-Saxon paganism was not simply a collection of primitive superstitions that could be easily displaced by superior Christian teaching, but a sophisticated religious system that provided meaningful explanations for natural phenomena, effective mechanisms for social organization, and compelling visions of human destiny that commanded the sincere devotion of millions of believers. The gradual process of religious conversion that began in Kent during Ceol's lifetime involved not only changes in formal belief and ritual practice, but also fundamental transformations in social relationships, legal traditions, and cultural values that touched every aspect of Anglo-Saxon life. The introduction of Christian concepts of individual salvation, universal brotherhood, and divine justice challenged traditional Germanic emphasis on kinship loyalty, warrior honor, and tribal identity in ways that required careful negotiation and gradual adaptation rather than immediate wholesale transformation. The diplomatic implications of religious conversion extended far beyond questions of personal belief and ritual practice to encompass complex issues of international relations and political alliance that affected the balance of power among the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. King Ethelbert's conversion created new opportunities for alliance with Christian kingdoms on the continent, while also potentially alienating pagan rulers who might view his adoption of foreign religious practices as a betrayal of traditional Anglo-Saxon values. The ecclesiastical organization that Augustine established in Kent provided institutional foundations for Christian expansion that would prove crucial for the religion's eventual success throughout Anglo-Saxon England. The cathedral church at Canterbury, the monastic communities that supported missionary activities, and the educational institutions that trained clergy and lay people in Christian teaching created permanent centers of religious authority that could survive political upheavals and continue spreading Christian influence even during periods of reduced royal support. The intellectual and cultural innovations that accompanied the introduction of Christianity, Latin literacy, continental artistic styles, Roman legal traditions, and Mediterranean theological concepts began to create new forms of cultural synthesis that would eventually transform Anglo-Saxon civilization far beyond what could be accomplished through simple political or military conquest. The gradual emergence of a distinctive Anglo-Saxon Christian culture that combined Germanic traditions with Roman ecclesiastical practices would become one of the great achievements of early medieval European civilization. The economic and social changes that resulted from Christian conversion included not only the establishment of new religious institutions that required ongoing financial support, but also modifications in traditional practices of gift-giving, kinship obligation, and social hierarchy that reflected Christian teaching about proper relationships between different groups within society. The Church's emphasis on charitable obligation, protection of the weak, and spiritual equality before God challenged some aspects of traditional Anglo-Saxon social organization while reinforcing others. The legal traditions that governed Anglo-Saxon society required careful modification as Christian concepts of justice, mercy, and divine law were gradually integrated with existing Germanic customary practices. The development of written law codes that reflected Christian moral teaching while maintaining practical effectiveness in governing warrior societies represented one of the great intellectual achievements of early Anglo-Saxon Christianity. The missionary strategies that proved most effective in converting Anglo-Saxon populations involved careful attention to existing religious sensibilities and cultural traditions, rather than wholesale rejection of everything associated with pagan practice. The adaptation of traditional festivals, sacred sites, and ritual practices to Christian purposes allowed for gradual religious transition that minimized social disruption while still accomplishing fundamental transformation in religious belief and practice. The resistance to Christian conversion that emerged in some Anglo-Saxon kingdoms reflected not only conservative attachment to traditional religious practices, but also legitimate concerns about the political and cultural implications of adopting foreign religious institutions. The perception that Christianity represented continental influence that might undermine Anglo-Saxon independence and traditional values created obstacles to missionary success that required careful diplomatic and theological response. The regional variations in the pace and character of Christian conversion throughout Anglo-Saxon England reflected the diverse political and cultural conditions that characterized different kingdoms during the late 6th, early 7th centuries. The particular circumstances that made Kent receptive to Augustine's mission were not necessarily present in other kingdoms where different approaches to religious change would prove necessary for achieving successful conversion. The long-term implications of the religious transformation that began during Ceol's lifetime would eventually extend far beyond questions of personal belief and ritual practice to encompass fundamental changes in Anglo-Saxon concepts of kingship, law, education, and cultural identity. The gradual emergence of a Christian Anglo-Saxon civilization that combined Germanic political traditions with Roman ecclesiastical institutions would provide the foundation for some of the greatest achievements in medieval European culture. The monastic traditions that accompanied Christian conversion created new forms of religious life that appealed particularly to individuals who sought alternatives to the warrior culture that dominated secular Anglo-Saxon society. The establishment of religious communities that emphasized prayer, learning, and charitable service provided opportunities for spiritual development that were not available within traditional religious framework. The educational developments that accompanied Christian conversion, the establishment of school, the promotion of literacy, and the preservation of classical learning, would eventually transform Anglo-Saxon intellectual life in ways that extended far beyond purely religious concerns. The gradual emergence of a learned class that could read and write Latin created new possibilities for governmental administration, legal development, and cultural achievement that would prove crucial for the future success of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. As we contemplate the distant thunder of religious change that began to rumble across Britain during Ceol's brief reign, we can appreciate how the quiet work of missionaries and the private religious decisions of individual rulers would ultimately prove more transformative than the political and military conflicts that dominated contemporary attention. The seeds of cultural revolution that were planted in Kent during 597 AD would eventually grow into one of the great flowering periods of European Christian civilization, demonstrating once again how the most significant historical changes often begin with seemingly modest developments that only reveal their full importance in retrospect. The military challenges that confronted Ceol throughout his brief reflected not only immediate consequences of the civil war that brought him to power, but also the broader strategic pressures that all Anglo-Saxon kingdoms faced as they struggled to maintain their independence and territorial integrity in an increasingly competitive political environment. The traditional military institutions that had served Wessex so effectively during the expansionist campaigns of Ceolin's earlier required fundamental reorganization to address the new realities of defensive war, limited resources, and questionable noble loyalty that characterized the kingdom during the 590s. The royal warband that had traditionally formed the core of West Saxon military strength had been decimated by the Battle of Wodnesbeorg and its aftermath, leaving Ceol with the complex task of rebuilding the kingdom's professional military capability while simultaneously managing the political sensitivities of noble families whose loyalty remained uncertain. The process of recruiting and training new warriors required not only significant financial resources, but also the kind of personal charisma and military reputation that could attract ambitious young fighters to royal service. The selection criteria for membership in the Royal Comitatus during this period of military reconstruction reflected both traditional Anglo-Saxon values and the practical necessities created by the kingdom's reduced circumstances. While birth, family connections, and previous military experience remained important considerations, Ceol also needed to prioritize personal loyalty and political reliability over purely martial qualifications when choosing the warriors who would form his innermost circle of military advisors and battlefield companions. The training regimens that prepared these new royal warriors for their military and political responsibilities combined traditional Germanic combat techniques with tactical innovations that reflected lessons learned from recent military defeats and the changing nature of warfare among the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The emphasis on disciplined formation fighting, coordinated cavalry operations, and siege warfare techniques demonstrated the kingdom's adaptation to more sophisticated military challenges than had characterized earlier periods of Anglo-Saxon expansion. The equipment and weaponry that distinguished royal warriors from ordinary soldiers represented significant investments in skilled craftsmanship and precious materials that testified to the kingdom's continued prosperity despite its political difficulties. The pattern-welded swords, iron-reinforced shields, and mail shirts that equipped the royal war served not only practical military functions, but also symbolic purposes that reinforced royal prestige and demonstrated the kingdom's capacity to reward loyal service with generous gifts. The local militia forces that provided the bulk of West Saxon defensive capability required careful coordination with royal military planning despite their control by semi-autonomous noble commanders whose political reliability could not be taken for granted. The system of military obligations that bound free farmers and craftsmen to seasonal service in local defense forces needed constant attention to ensure that these forces would respond effectively to royal commands during moments of crisis. The fortification systems that protected key strategic positions throughout the kingdom represented one area where Ceol's defensive strategy proved particularly innovative and effective. The renovation of existing Roman fortifications, the construction of new earthwork defenses, and the establishment of signal systems that could coordinate military responses across extended territory demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the engineering and logistical challenges involved in defensive war. The garrison forces that manned these fortifications required ongoing support and reinforcement that stretched the kingdom's military resources, while also providing opportunities for demonstrating royal commitment to territorial defense. The rotation of garrison duties among different noble families helped distribute the burden of military service while also ensuring no single family could gain strategically important defensive positions. The intelligence networks that provided early preparatory development relied heavily on the personal relationship and commercial connections that linked Wessex to neighboring kingdoms. The careful cultivation of informants, the analysis of refugee reports, and the interpretation of diplomatic communications required sophisticated understanding of regional political dynamics, military capability. The logistical arrangements that supported military operations during this period of reduced resources demanded careful attention to supply procurement, transportation, and storage that could maintain fighting effectiveness while minimizing the economic burden on civilian populations. The establishment of supply depots, the negotiation of provisioning agreements, and the coordination of transport services required administrative capabilities that tested the limits of 6th century governmental institutions. The tactical doctrines that guided West Saxon military operations during Ceol's reign reflected hard-learned lessons about the limitations of aggressive offensive warfare when resources were limited and political support was uncertain. The emphasis on defensive positioning, strategic withdrawal, and coordinated counterattacks demonstrated mature understanding of how to maximize military effectiveness while minimizing the risks that could result from unsuccessful campaigns. The alliance relationships that supplemented West Saxon military capabilities required ongoing diplomatic attention and careful balance between competing demands for mutual assistance and independent action. The negotiation of military cooperation agreements, the coordination of joint campaigns, and the resolution of disputes over territorial boundaries all demanded sophisticated diplomatic skills that could maintain beneficial relationships while preserving essential kingdom autonomy. The recruitment policies that expanded the available pool of military manpower during periods of crisis reflected both practical necessities and important precedents for the future development of Anglo-Saxon military institutions. The incorporation of former enemies, the elevation of promising commoners, and the integration of foreign specialists demonstrated flexibility in military organization that would prove valuable for future royal administrations. The seasonal patterns of military activity that governed campaign planning and defensive preparations followed traditional rhythms that reflected both practical considerations about weather and agriculture and strategic calculations about enemy capabilities and intentions. The coordination of spring mobilization, summer campaigning, autumn harvest protection, and winter training activities required sophisticated planning and communication systems that tested administrative capabilities. The veteran leadership that provided tactical expertise and inspirational example for younger warriors represented one of the most valuable military assets available to royal commanders during this period of institutional rebuilding. The careful integration of experienced fighters who had served under previous regimes with newly recruited supporters required delicate attention to questions of honor, precedence, and political reliability. The specialized military roles that supported combat operations, scouts, engineers, communication specialists, and medical personnel, required ongoing development and training that expanded the kingdom's military capabilities beyond simple battlefield effectiveness. The establishment of training programs, equipment standards, and career advancement opportunities for these specialist positions demonstrated sophisticated understanding of military organization. The morale factors that determined military effectiveness during periods of political uncertainty required constant attention to the psychological and spiritual needs of warriors whose loyalty and courage provided the ultimate foundation for kingdom defense. The maintenance of traditional ceremonies, the fair distribution of rewards, and the demonstration of effective leadership all contributed to the esprit de corps that distinguished successful military organizations from mere collections of armed individuals. The technological innovations that enhanced military effectiveness, improved metallurgy, better fortification techniques, and more sophisticated communication systems reflected the kingdom's capacity for adaptation and learning despite the political and economic pressures that constrained other aspects of governmental activity. The investment in military research and development demonstrated long-term thinking about kingdom security that extended beyond immediate tactical concerns. As we contemplate the military challenges that confronted Ceol throughout his brief but eventful, we can appreciate how the fundamental requirements of kingdom defense shaped every aspect of royal policy and governmental activity. The patient work of rebuilding military institutions, training effective forces, and establishing defensive capabilities that could protect the kingdom's independence and territorial integrity required the same kind of careful attention to practical details and personal relationships that characterized all aspects of successful Anglo-Saxon statecraft. The military legacy that Ceol passed on to his successors included not only the tactical necessary for kingdom defense, but also institutional and organizational precedents that would prove valuable future generations of West Saxon rule. The defensive strategies, alliance relationships, and administrative procedures that emerged during this period of military reconstruction would continue to influence Anglo-Saxon military development long after the specific crises that prompted their creation had been resolved. The economic foundations that supported Ceol's kingdom represented a complex integration of agricultural production, craft manufacture, and commercial exchange that had evolved over generations of Anglo-Saxon settlement and adaptation to British conditions. Understanding these economic systems provides crucial insight into the practical constraints and opportunities that shaped royal policy during a period when reduced military effectiveness and political fragmentation created new challenges for generating and distributing the resources necessary for effective governance. The agricultural sector that formed the backbone of the West Saxon economy was organized around the fundamental unit of the family farm, where free farmers worked inherited or granted lands under complex arrangements of obligation and protection that connected rural producers to noble landowners and ultimately to royal authority. These relationships, while based on traditional Germanic concepts of personal loyalty and mutual obligation, had adapted to British conditions in ways that created more sophisticated systems of resource management than had characterized the original Saxon home. The crop production that provided the basic foodstuffs for kingdom survival followed seasonal patterns that reflected both practical agricultural knowledge accumulated over generations of experience and supernatural beliefs about the proper relationship between human activity and natural forces. The three-field system of rotation, which alternated between winter grain, spring crops, and fallow periods, maximized agricultural productivity while maintaining soil fertility through natural processes that early medieval farmers understood empirically, if not scientifically. The livestock management that supplemented crop production with protein, dairy products, and industrial raw materials required sophisticated understanding of breeding technique, pasture management, and seasonal migration patterns that could optimize resource utilization while minimizing conflicts over grazing rights and territorial boundaries. The careful balance between different types of animal, cattle for draft power and prestige, sheep, pigs for forest foraging, and horses for transportation and military service, reflected complex calculations about resource allocation and economic priorities. The woodland resources that provided building material and forage for livestock represented one of the most valuable assets available to Anglo-Saxon communities, but their exploitation required management to prevent that could diminish long-term productivity. The traditional rights and obligations that governed access to forest resources created complex legal relationships that connected individual families to broader community interests while also providing mechanisms for royal control over strategically important natural resources. The craft production that supplied tools, weapons, clothing, and luxury goods for Anglo-Saxon society was organized around specialized workshops that combined family traditions of technical knowledge with access to raw materials and distribution network that could support full-time artisan activity. The metalworking, textile production, leather crafting, and woodworking that provided essential manufactured goods represented significant investments in human capital and technical infrastructure that contributed substantially to overall economic productivity. The trade relationships that connected Wessex to neighboring kingdom and continental markets provided access to exotic goods and specialized products that could not be produced locally, while also creating opportunities for exporting surplus agricultural and craft products that generated wealth for royal treasuries and noble households. The river systems and Roman road networks that facilitated commercial transport created natural trade corridors that influenced settlement patterns and political relationships throughout the kingdom. The monetary systems that governed commercial exchange during this period represented an interesting transition between traditional Germanic practices of gift-giving and barter and newer Roman-influenced concepts of standardized currency and market pricing. The gradual introduction of coined money for certain types of transactions coexisted with older systems of value measurement based on livestock, precious metals, and traditional exchange relationships that reflected social status as well as economic calculation. The royal estates that provided direct income for governmental activities represented the most sophisticated examples of Anglo-Saxon agricultural management, with coordinated production systems that could generate substantial surpluses for supporting military forces, royal households, and the various forms of patronage that maintained political loyalty. The administration of these estates required managerial skills that combined practical agricultural knowledge with political understanding of how rural communities functioned under noble supervision. The tribute relationships that supplemented direct royal income through payments from subordinate territories and defeated enemies provided crucial financial resources for maintaining military forces and political influence, but they also created ongoing administrative challenges that required constant attention to collection procedures, assessment methods, and enforcement mechanisms. The negotiation and renegotiation of tribute arrangements reflected changing political relationships and military capabilities that influenced the kingdom's overall economic position. The taxation systems that extracted resources from free farmers and craft producers for public purposes remained relatively undeveloped during this early period of Anglo-Saxon political organization, but the various forms of labor service, military obligation, and in-kind payments that supported governmental activities represented nascent forms of public finance that would evolve into more sophisticated fiscal institutions in later centuries. The market institutions that facilitated commercial exchange and price discovery were beginning to emerge in some of the larger settlements and trading centers, but most economic activity continued to follow traditional patterns of direct exchange between producers and consumers, or redistribution through noble households and royal courts. The periodic fairs and seasonal gatherings that brought together merchants, craftsmen, and customers from wide geographical areas provided opportunities for commercial innovation and cultural exchange that enriched local economic life. The labor systems that provided the human resources necessary for agricultural production, craft manufacture, and public works projects combined free wage labor with various forms of obligated service that reflected social status and political relationships. The careful balance between voluntary participation and compulsory service in community activities required ongoing negotiation and adjustment as economic conditions and political circumstances changed. The resource management practices that governed the exploitation of natural assets, mines, quarries, fisheries, and salt works, required coordination between private interests and public needs that tested the administrative capabilities of early medieval governmental institutions. The development of regulatory frameworks that could ensure sustainable utilization while providing adequate returns for investors and operators represented one of the ongoing challenges facing royal administrators. The investment patterns that directed available capital toward productive activities reflected both individual calculations about personal advancement and community decisions about collective priorities that could enhance overall economic welfare. The construction of mills, bridges, roads, and other infrastructure projects required cooperative arrangements that demonstrated the capacity for long-term planning and resource mobilization that characterized successful Anglo-Saxon communities. The distribution networks that moved goods from producers to consumers relied heavily on personal relationships and traditional exchange patterns that had developed over generations of commercial activity. The river transport, overland trading routes, and seasonal market circuits that connected different regions of the kingdom created economic integration that supported political unity while also providing mechanisms for cultural exchange and technological diffusion. The storage and preservation technique that allowed communities to survive seasonal variations in food production and prepare for periods of scarcity or military disruption represented crucial economic capabilities that required ongoing investment in physical infrastructure and technical knowledge. The granaries, root cellars, and preservation facilities that maintained food security demonstrated the sophistication of Anglo-Saxon resource management practices. The credit and financing arrangements that supported commercial activities and major investment projects were beginning to develop more formal institutional structures. Though most financial relationships continued to operate through personal networks of trust and obligation that reflected social status rather than purely economic calculation, the emergence of more sophisticated financial instruments would represent one of the important economic developments of the following centuries. The economic planning that coordinated different aspects of production and exchange required understanding of complex relationships between agricultural cycles, craft production schedules, military requirements, and political priorities that tested the analytical capabilities of royal advisors and noble administrators. The development of more systematic approaches to economic policy would become increasingly important as Anglo-Saxon kingdoms faced more complex challenges in later periods. As we contemplate the economic foundations that supported Ceol's brief but significant reign, we can appreciate how the practical requirements of generating and distributing material resources shaped every aspect of royal policy and governmental activity. The patient work of maintaining agricultural productivity, supporting craft development, facilitating commercial exchange, and managing public resources required the same kind of careful attention to practical details and personal relationships that characterized all aspects of successful Anglo-Saxon statecraft. The economic legacy that Ceol passed on to his successors included not only the immediate productive capabilities necessary for kingdom survival, but also institutional innovations and administrative precedents that would prove valuable for future generations of West Saxon rulers. The resource management practices, commercial relationships, and fiscal procedures that emerged during this period of political reconstruction would continue to influence Anglo-Saxon economic development long after the specific crises that prompted their creation had been resolved. The royal court that Ceol established after his victory at Wodnesbeorg served not merely as the king's residence, but as the beating heart of West Saxon political, cultural, and social life, a complex institution that needed to project authority and prosperity while also managing the practical requirements of governing a kingdom under severe pressure from both internal divisions and external threats. The successful operation of this court required delicate balance between competing demands for ceremonial grandeur and administrative efficiency, creating an environment where the ancient traditions of Germanic warrior culture could adapt to the sophisticated requirements of 6th century statecraft. The great hall that formed the physical center of royal court life represented one of the most impressive architectural achievements of Anglo-Saxon, a massive timber structure whose soaring roofline and elaborately carved supporting pillars proclaimed the king's power and prosperity to all who entered its sacred precincts. The construction and maintenance of such a building required enormous investments of skilled labor and precious materials that testified to the kingdom's continued wealth, despite its recent political troubles, while also providing practical space for the various ceremonial and administrative activities that defined royal court life. The daily rhythms of court activity followed patterns that had been established over generations of Anglo-Saxon royal tradition, but required constant adaptation to the changing political circumstances that characterized Ceol's reign. The morning hours typically focused on military planning and administrative business, as the king met with his closest advisors to review intelligence reports, plan defensive measures, and coordinate the complex logistical arrangements necessary for maintaining royal authority across the kingdom's fragmented territories. The afternoon activities often centered around judicial proceedings and diplomatic receptions, as representatives from throughout the kingdom and beyond sought royal attention for legal disputes, political negotiations, and ceremonial obligations that reinforced the personal relationships upon which Anglo-Saxon governance ultimately depended. These sessions required careful orchestration to ensure that proper respect was shown to all participants, while also advancing royal interests and maintaining the dignity appropriate to sovereign authority. The evening gatherings that concluded each day's court activities represented perhaps the most important aspect of royal court life, as the formal feasting and entertainment that brought together the king's household, visiting noble and honored guests, provided opportunities for the informal political discussion and personal relationship building that formed the foundation of effective Anglo-Saxon statecraft. The quality and abundance of food and drink served at these gatherings, the skill of the poets and musicians who provided entertainment, and the generosity of the king in distributing gifts and honors all contributed to the royal reputation for magnificence that was essential for maintaining political support. The household organization that supported these court activities required sophisticated administrative arrangements that could coordinate the activities of hundreds of people, meaning the security, comfort, appropriate to royal status. The various officials who managed different aspects of court life, stewards, chamberlains, marshals, and chaplain, needed to possess not only technical competence in their specialized areas, but also political sensitivity that could navigate the complex web of personal relationships and competing interests that characterized any royal court. The security arrangements that protected the royal court from external threats and internal conspiracies represented one of the most challenging aspects of court administration during a period when political remained uncertain and military threats required constant vigilance. The system of guards, sentries, and trusted retainers who controlled access to royal presence needed to balance effectiveness against the accessibility that was necessary for maintaining the personal relationships upon which royal authority ultimately. The ceremonial protocol that governed court life served multiple functions beyond simple pageantry, creating formal structures that reinforced social hierarchies, demonstrated royal magnificence, and provided predictable frameworks for conducting the complex negotiations that characterized Anglo-Saxon political relationships. The elaborate rituals surrounding royal audiences, feast celebrations, and diplomatic receptions required careful planning and precise execution that could either enhance or diminish royal prestige depending on their effectiveness. The cultural activities that enriched court life represented significant investments in artistic patronage that served both entertainment functions and important political purposes related to royal prestige and cultural leadership. The poets who composed and recited epic narratives celebrated royal achievements, the musicians who provided accompaniment for ceremonial occasions, and the craftsmen who produced the luxury goods that demonstrated royal wealth, all contributed to the cultural atmosphere that distinguished royal courts from ordinary noble households. The educational functions that royal courts performed for young nobles who came to learn the arts of warfare, statecraft, and courtly behavior represented crucial investments in human capital that would provide future leadership for the kingdom, while also creating personal bonds between the royal family and noble houses throughout the realm. The training programs that prepared these young men for their future responsibilities combined practical instruction in military skills with broader education in law, diplomacy, and cultural refinement. The information networks that connected the royal court to events throughout the kingdom and beyond relied heavily on the personal relationships and commercial connections that brought visitors to court seeking royal favor or conducting official business. The careful analysis of reports from travelers, merchants, diplomats, and local officials provided the intelligence that royal advisors needed for making informed decisions about policy and strategy. The economic activities that supported court operations required careful coordination between different sources of income and various categories of expenditure that could maintain royal magnificence while also providing adequate resources for military defense and governmental administration. The management of royal estates, the collection of tribute payments, and the regulation of commercial activities all contributed to the complex fiscal arrangements that sustained court life. The religious observances that provided spiritual legitimacy for royal authority required ongoing attention to traditional pagan ceremony and seasonal festivals that connected royal power to divine sanction, while also accommodating the gradual introduction of Christian influences that were beginning to affect Anglo-Saxon culture. The maintenance of proper relationships with religious leaders and the performance of appropriate ritual obligations remained essential elements of successful kingship throughout this period of religious transition. The diplomatic activities that maintained relationships with neighboring kingdoms and foreign powers required sophisticated understanding of international politics and cultural differences that could advance royal interests while avoiding conflict that might exceed the kingdom's military capabilities. The reception of foreign ambassadors, the negotiation of alliance agreements, and the management of commercial relationships all demanded diplomatic skills that reflected well on royal competence and political sophistication. The legal functions that royal courts performed in resolving disputes and establishing precedents for future cases required careful balance between traditional Germanic law and newer legal concepts that reflected changing social conditions and political requirements. The judicial proceedings that took place under royal supervision provided opportunities for demonstrating royal wisdom and commitment to justice while also advancing particular political interests through careful interpretation of customary. The seasonal migrations that brought royal courts to different regions of the kingdom served multiple purposes related to administration, security, and political relationship building that were essential for maintaining effective governance across extended territories. These royal progresses provided opportunities for direct royal involvement in affairs, while also demonstrating royal power and accessibility to subjects who might otherwise have little contact with central governmental institutions. The record-keeping activities that preserved important information about legal decisions, financial transactions, and political agreements represented early attempts to develop more systematic administrative procedures that could enhance governmental effectiveness, while also providing historical documentation for future reference. The gradual development of written records alongside traditional oral traditions would become increasingly important for Anglo-Saxon governmental development in later periods. The cultural exchange that occurred when visitors from different regions and kingdoms gathered at royal court created opportunities for technological transfer, artistic innovation, and intellectual development that enriched Anglo-Saxon civilization, while also advancing royal interests through enhanced prestige and cultural leadership. The cosmopolitan atmosphere that characterized successful royal courts provided natural settings for the cultural synthesis that would be the great achievements of early medieval civilization. As we contemplate the complex institution that was Ceol royal court, we can appreciate how the successful operation of this multifaceted organization required administrative skills, political wisdom, and cultural sophistication that rivaled the governmental achievements of much later historical periods. The patient work of building and maintaining the personal relationships, ceremonial traditions, and practical capabilities that made royal courts effective centers of political authority required the same kind of careful attention to detail and long-term planning that characterized all aspects of successful Anglo-Saxon statecraft. The architectural innovations that distinguished royal courts from ordinary noble dwellings reflected both practical necessities and symbolic requirements that demonstrated royal status while accommodating the complex activities that characterized court life. The design and construction of royal halls required understanding of structural engineering, acoustics, and spatial organization that could create impressive ceremonial spaces while also providing practical facilities for administration, storage, and defense. The artistic traditions that flourished under royal patronage created distinctive styles of decoration, craftsmanship, and cultural expression that influenced broader patterns of artistic development throughout Anglo-Saxon society. The wall hangings, carved pillars, metalwork, and ceremonial objects that adorned royal halls served not only aesthetic functions, but also political purposes related to demonstrating royal wealth, cultural sophistication, and connection to ancient traditions of Germanic kingship. The library and documentary collections that supported royal administration represented early attempts to preserve important information in written form, while maintaining the oral traditions that continued to play crucial roles in Anglo-Saxon cultural life. The gradual accumulation of legal records, correspondence, genealogies, and other documentary materials would provide foundations for more sophisticated governmental procedures in later periods. The workshop activities that supplied royal courts with specialized goods and services required coordination between skilled craftsmen and royal officials who could ensure adequate supplies of weapons, jewelry, ceremonial objects, and other manufactured goods that met the high standards appropriate for use. The concentration of master craftsmen at royal courts created centers of technical innovation and artistic excellence that influenced broader patterns of economic and cultural development. The communication systems that connected royal courts to distant parts of the kingdom relied on networks of messengers, signal fires, and traveling officials who could transmit royal commands and collect information about local conditions with sufficient speed and reliability to support effective governance. The development of more systematic communication procedures represented one of the important administrative innovations of this period. The entertainment traditions that provided recreation and cultural enrichment for court society included not only formal ceremonies and feast celebrations, but also more informal activities like hunting, gaming, storytelling, and musical performance that created opportunities for social interaction and personal relationship building among court members. These recreational activities served important political functions by providing neutral settings for diplomatic negotiation and alliance building. The guest accommodation facilities that housed the constant stream of visitors to royal courts required careful attention to security, comfort, and social precedence that could demonstrate appropriate hospitality while maintaining proper distinctions of rank and status. The management of guest quarters, dining arrangements, and ceremonial protocols for visiting dignitaries tested the administrative capabilities of court officials while providing opportunities for advancing royal interests through generous hospitality. The medical and health services that maintained the physical well-being of court members represented significant investments in specialized knowledge and equipment that reflected growing understanding of disease prevention and treatment techniques. The presence of skilled healers at royal courts provided not only practical health benefits, but also enhanced royal reputation for wisdom and care for followers' welfare. The transportation systems that supported royal court mobility during seasonal migrations and military campaigns required coordination between horse breeding programs, vehicle maintenance, road construction, and supply procurement that could ensure reliable movement of large numbers of people and equipment across considerable distances. The development of more efficient transportation capabilities enhanced royal ability to maintain direct involvement in governmental activities throughout the kingdom. The waste management and sanitation procedures that maintained health and comfort standards in densely populated court environments represented early attempts to address the public health challenges that accompanied urban concentration and intensive human activity. The development of effective sanitation systems would become increasingly important as royal courts grew larger and more complex in later periods. The brief reign of King Ceol, lasting only 5 years from 592 to 597 AD, might easily be dismissed as a minor footnote in the grand sweep of Anglo-Saxon history, were it not for the remarkable dynastic legacy that emerged from his bloodline and would continue to shape the political landscape of Wessex for nearly a century. The Ceolian line, as historians would later term this branch of the West Saxon royal, represented far more than a simple continuation of existing political traditions. It embodied a new approach to Anglo-Saxon kingship that emphasized careful consolidation over aggressive expansion and proved remarkably successful in adapting to the changing circumstances that would characterize 7th century Britain. The succession arrangements that Ceol established for his kingdom reflected both practical necessities and sophisticated understanding of Anglo-Saxon political culture that prioritized effective leadership over strict adherence to primogeniture. His decision to accept that his brother Ceolwulf would succeed him instead of his young son Cenegols demonstrated mature political judgment that placed kingdom stability above personal dynastic ambitions, creating precedents that would influence West Saxon succession practices for generations to come. The political innovations that emerged during Ceol's reign would prove to have lasting influence on Anglo-Saxon governmental development far beyond their immediate practical applications. The emphasis on negotiation and consensus building over military coercion, the careful balance between central authority and local autonomy, and the patient approach to institutional development that characterized his administration established new models for royal leadership that would be adopted and refined by subsequent generations of West Saxon rulers. The territorial consolidation that Ceol achieved during his brief reign, while less dramatic than the expansionist conquests that had characterized his uncle's earlier campaigns, proved more sustainable in the long term and created stable foundations for future growth that would serve his successors well. The defensive arrangements, alliance relationships, and administrative procedures that emerged during this period of careful reconstruction would continue to provide effective frameworks for West Saxon governance long after the immediate crises that prompted their creation had been resolved. The cultural developments that occurred during Ceol's reign reflected broader transformations in Anglo-Saxon society that were beginning to create new forms of cultural synthesis between Germanic traditions and influences from Roman civilization and Christian culture. The royal patronage of poets, craftsmen, and ritual specialists that continued despite the kingdom's reduced resources demonstrated commitment to maintaining the cultural institutions that provided meaning and identity for Anglo-Saxon communities. The economic policies that sustained the kingdom during this period of political uncertainty established important precedents for resource management and fiscal administration that would prove valuable for future administrations. The careful balance between taxation and voluntary contribution, the negotiation of tribute arrangements with subordinate territories, and the management of royal estates and commercial relationships all contributed to governmental capabilities that enhanced rather than diminished overall economic prosperity. The military reforms that emerged from the challenges facing Ceol's kingdom created new approaches to defense and security that proved better adapted to the changing strategic environment of late 6th century Britain than the aggressive offensive strategies that had characterized earlier periods of West Saxon expansion. The emphasis on fortification, alliance warfare, and professional military organization would continue to influence Anglo-Saxon military development throughout the following century. The diplomatic relationships that Ceol carefully cultivated with neighboring kingdoms established patterns of international cooperation and conflict resolution that would prove crucial for maintaining West Saxon independence and territorial integrity during periods of increasing political complexity and external pressure. The precedents established during his reign for negotiating alliance agreements, managing tributary relationships, and resolving border disputes would continue to guide Anglo-Saxon diplomacy for generations. The legal developments that occurred during Ceol reflected both practical necessities created the recent political upheavals and broader trends toward more sophisticated legal institutions beginning to emerge throughout Anglo-Saxon England. The procedures for resolving property disputes, managing inheritance claims, and administering justice in cases involved established important precedents that would influence West Saxon legal for centuries to come. The religious policies that Ceol pursued during the crucial period when Christianity beginning to establish itself in kingdoms demonstrated sophisticated understanding and cultural implications of religious change while maintaining respect for traditional pagan institutions that continued to provide spiritual legitimacy. This careful balance between innovation and tradition would prove valuable for his successors as they navigated the challenges of religious conversion in later decades. The educational initiatives that emerged during Ceol's reign, while limited by the resources available and the pressing demands of political consolidation, established important precedents for royal support of learning and cultural development that would prove crucial for the intellectual achievements of later Anglo-Saxon civilization. The court schools, apprenticeship programs, and cultural patronage that continued despite political pressures demonstrated commitment to long-term cultural development that extended beyond immediate political concern. The architectural and artistic achievements that characterized Ceol's court reflected both practical requirements for governmental facilities and symbolic needs for demonstrating royal prestige and cultural sophistication. The building projects, craft workshops, and artistic commissions that continued despite reduced resources established precedents for royal patronage that would influence Anglo-Saxon cultural development throughout the following centuries. The administrative innovations that emerged during this period of governmental reconstruction created new approaches to record-keeping, communication, and bureaucratic organization that would prove valuable for future royal administrations. The procedures for managing royal estates, coordinating military activities, and maintaining diplomatic relationships established institutional foundations that would support more sophisticated governmental activities in later periods. The social policies that Ceol pursued during his reign reflected careful attention to the needs and concerns of different groups within Anglo-Saxon society, while maintaining traditional, hierarchical relationships that provided stability and predictability for social interactions. The balance between innovation and tradition that characterized his approach to social issues would continue to influence West Saxon social development long after his death. The intellectual developments that occurred during Ceol's reign, while often overshadowed by more dramatic political and military events, established important precedents for royal support of learning and cultural achievement that would prove crucial for the remarkable intellectual flowering that would characterize later Anglo-Saxon civilization. The scholarly activities, technological innovations, and cultural exchanges that continued despite political pressures demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the relationship between cultural development and political success. The dynastic arrangements that Ceol established through his family relationships and marriage alliances created networks of political connection and mutual obligation that would continue to influence Anglo-Saxon politics for generations. The careful cultivation of relationships with other royal houses, the strategic placement of family members in positions of influence, and the establishment of inheritance patterns that balanced competing claims all contributed to political stability that enhanced rather than diminished kingdom effectiveness. The legacy institutions that emerged during Ceol's reign, governmental procedures, military organizations, economic arrangements, and cultural traditions, would continue to provide frameworks for West Saxon political development long after the specific individuals who created them had passed from the scene. The patient work of institutional building and cultural development that characterized his administration demonstrated understanding of the relationship between short-term political success and long-term civilizational achievement that would prove crucial for Anglo-Saxon historical. As we contemplate the remarkable transformation that occurred during Ceol's brief but significant reign, we can appreciate how the foundations laid during this period of careful reconstruction would support some of the greatest achievements in Anglo-Saxon political and cultural development. The Ceolian dynasty that emerged from his bloodline would continue to rule Wessex for much of the 7th century, providing the stability and institutional continuity that enabled the kingdom to adapt successfully to the challenges of religious conversion, territorial expansion, and cultural synthesis that would characterize the following centuries. The memory of Ceol's reign, preserved in the genealogies and historical traditions that maintained Anglo-Saxon cultural identity, would continue to provide inspiration and guidance for future generations of West Saxon rulers who faced similar challenges of political reconstruction and institutional development. The precedents established during his administration for balancing competing interests, managing scarce resources, and maintaining cultural continuity while adapting to changing circumstances would prove valuable for rulers throughout the Anglo-Saxon period. The year 597 AD marked not only the conclusion of Ceol's brief but significant reign, but also a pivotal moment in the broader transformation of Anglo-Saxon England as distant events in Kent began to set in motion religious and cultural changes that would eventually reshape the entire political and social landscape of Britain. As Ceol faced the final challenges of his kingship during this fateful year, he could hardly have imagined that missionary activities occurring hundreds of miles from his kingdom would ultimately be more historically significant than any of the political and military struggles that dominated his immediate attention. The seasonal rhythm of royal activities during 597 followed patterns that had been established over generations of Anglo-Saxon tradition, beginning with the spring assemblies, where nobles gathered to discuss military preparations, resolve legal disputes, and coordinate the administrative activities that would occupy the coming year. These gatherings assumed particular importance during Ceol's final year as king, as the ongoing challenges of maintaining political unity and territorial security required constant attention to the personal relationships and institutional arrangements that held the kingdom together. The spring campaigns that traditionally marked the beginning of each year's military activities were notably subdued during 597, reflecting both the defensive orientation that had characterized Ceol's entire reign and the practical limitations imposed by the kingdom's reduced military capabilities. Rather than launching ambitious offensive operations against neighboring territories, West Saxon forces focused on maintaining border security, strengthening fortifications, and conducting the training exercises that prepared local militias for potential defensive operations. The agricultural activities that dominated rural life during the growing season of 597 proceeded according to time-honored patterns that reflected generations of accumulated knowledge about soil management, crop rotation, and livestock breeding. The abundant harvest that characterized this particular provided welcome relief from the economic pressures that had constrained royal resources throughout Ceol, while also creating opportunities for the generous gift-giving and feast celebrations that reinforced political loyalties and social bonds. The diplomatic activities that occupied much of Ceol's attention during his final year reflected the complex web of alliance relationships and territorial agreements that had emerged from his patient approach to international relations. The negotiation of tribute arrangements, the resolution of border disputes, and the careful management of relationships with neighboring kingdoms all required ongoing attention that tested the diplomatic skills of royal advisors and the king's own political judgment. The judicial proceedings that brought the king's court throughout the kingdom during the traditional autumn circuit provided opportunities for demonstrating royal commitment to justice and legal consistency, while also gathering intelligence about local conditions and political sentiments. These sessions, while often dealing with relatively mundane disputes over property rights and commercial obligations, served crucial functions in maintaining the personal relationships between royal authority and local communities that provided the foundation for effective governance. The religious observances that marked the seasonal transitions of 597 followed traditional pagan patterns that connected royal authority to divine sanction, while also acknowledging the distant but growing influence of Christian teachings that were beginning to penetrate even remote areas of Anglo-Saxon England. The maintenance of proper relationships with traditional religious leaders and the performance of appropriate ritual obligations remained essential elements of successful kingship throughout this period of gradual religious transition. The cultural activities that enriched court life during Ceol's final year demonstrated continued royal commitment to maintaining the artistic and intellectual traditions that provided meaning and identity for Anglo-Saxon society. Despite the resource constraints and political pressures that characterized his reign, the patronage of poets, musicians, and craftsmen that continued throughout 597 established precedents for cultural support that would prove valuable for his successors as they sought to restore royal prestige and political influence. The economic policies that Ceol pursued during his final year in power reflected both the lessons learned from his earlier administrative experiences and the changing circumstances that created new opportunities for fiscal innovation and resource development. The careful management of royal estates, the negotiation of commercial agreements, and the establishment of market regulations all contributed to economic recovery that enhanced rather than diminished overall kingdom prosperity. The military preparations that occupied royal attention during the later months of 597 focused primarily on defensive arrangements and the training programs that prepared both professional warriors and local militias for the challenges that would face the kingdom under new leadership. The emphasis on institutional continuity and organizational effectiveness that characterized these preparations demonstrated Ceol's commitment to providing his successor with viable military capabilities, despite the constraints that had limited his own strategic options. The succession planning that dominated political discussions during Ceol's final months required careful attention to the competing claims and political sensitivities that surrounded the transfer of royal authority in Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The arrangements that confirmed his brother Ceolwulf as the designated heir reflected both practical considerations about leadership capability and sophisticated understanding of political dynamics that could either enhance or undermine kingdom stability during transitional periods. The foreign intelligence that reached the West Saxon court during 597 brought news of remarkable developments in Kent, where King Ethelbert had received Augustine's mission and begun the process of converting to Christianity that would eventually transform religious life throughout Anglo-Saxon England. While these distant events seem to have little immediate relevance for West Saxon affairs, they represented the beginning of cultural changes that would ultimately affect every aspect of Anglo-Saxon civilization. The health concerns that began to affect Ceol during the later months of 597 reflected both the physical toll of 5 years of intensive royal responsibilities and the psychological pressures created by the constant vigilance required for maintaining political stability in a fragmented kingdom. The traditional remedies and spiritual practices that supported royal health during this period demonstrated the continuing importance of pagan religious traditions in providing comfort and meaning during times of personal crisis. The administrative arrangements that Ceol established during his final months in power reflected careful attention to ensuring continuity of governmental operations during the transition to new leadership, the appointment of trusted officials to key positions, the establishment of clear procedures for routine administrative activities, and the careful documentation of important political agreements all demonstrated commitment to institutional stability that extended beyond personal political interests. The cultural legacy that Ceol prepared to leave his successors included not only the immediate practical capabilities necessary for kingdom governance, but also the intellectual and artistic achievements that had continued to flourish under royal patronage despite political pressures and resource constraints. The poets, craftsmen, and scholars who had received royal support during his reign would continue to provide cultural leadership that enhanced West Saxon prestige and political influence for generations to come. The final political acts of Ceol's reign reflected the patient, consensus-building approach to royal leadership that had characterized his entire administration, the careful consultation with noble advisors, the respectful attention to traditional procedures, and the graceful preparation for succession all demonstrated political maturity that provided valuable precedents for future generations of West Saxon rulers facing similar challenges of political transition. As the year 597 drew to a close and Ceol's life ebbed away, the king could reflect with satisfaction on accomplishments that, while perhaps less dramatic than those of his more aggressive predecessors, had nonetheless provided crucial foundations for the future development of West Saxon political institutions and cultural traditions. The patient work of rebuilding royal authority, maintaining kingdom unity, and adapting traditional governmental practices to changing circumstances had created stable platforms for future growth that would serve his successors well in the challenging decades ahead. The peaceful transfer of power that occurred upon Ceol's death demonstrated the effectiveness of the succession arrangements he had carefully established and provided valuable precedents for future dynastic transitions that would help maintain political stability throughout the tumultuous centuries that lay ahead. The legacy of thoughtful leadership and institutional innovation that he left to his brother and eventual successor, Ceol, would continue to influence West Saxon political development long after the immediate circumstances that prompted their creation had been forgotten. The final recognition of Ceol's reign came not from dramatic military victories or territorial conquests, but from the quiet acknowledgement of nobles and subjects throughout the kingdom that his leadership had provided exactly the kind of steady, thoughtful governance that Wessex had needed during its period of political crisis, institutional reconstruction. The foundation he laid for future generations of West Saxon rulers would prove more valuable than any temporary military triumph or territorial gain, demonstrating once again that the most significant historical achievements often emerge from patient attention to practical details rather than dramatic gestures that capture immediate attention but lack lasting substance. As we reach the end of our gentle journey through the brief but significant reign of King Ceol of Wessex, we find ourselves contemplating one of history's most intriguing paradoxes: how a ruler remembered as forgotten could leave such a profound and lasting on the development of Anglo-Saxon civilization. The 5 years from 592 to 597 that marked Ceol's time on the West Saxon throne represented far more than a simple interlude between reigns. They constituted a crucial reconstruction and institutional innovation that would shape the future of English kingship for centuries to come. The quiet revolution that Ceol accomplished through his patient approach to governance demonstrated that effective leadership need not always manifest itself through dramatic military conquests or spectacular political gestures. His achievement lay rather in the careful work of rebuilding political institutions, maintaining cultural continuity, and adapting traditional practices to changing circumstances. Tasks that required exactly the kind of steady, thoughtful leadership that he provided during Wessex's period of greatest crisis and uncertainty. The dynasty that emerged from Ceol's bloodline would continue to rule Wessex for much of the 7th century, providing the political stability and institutional continuity that enabled the kingdom to successfully navigate the challenges of religious conversion, territorial expansion, and cultural synthesis that would characterize the following centuries. The Ceolian line that included kings like Ceneguls, Ceawlin, and Ceawlin would build upon the foundations that Ceol established, creating some of the most successful and innovative governmental institutions in Anglo-Saxon England. The administrative innovations that emerged during Ceol's reign, the emphasis on consensus building over military coercion, the careful balance between central authority and local autonomy, and the patient approach to institutional development would prove remarkably prescient in anticipating the governmental challenges that would face Anglo-Saxon kingdoms as they evolved from simple warrior societies into complex political entities capable of effective administration over large territories and diverse populations. The cultural developments that occurred during this period of political reconstruction reflected broader transformations in Anglo-Saxon society that were beginning to create new forms of synthesis between Germanic traditions and influences from Roman civilization and emerging Christian culture. The royal patronage that continued despite reduced resources and political pressures demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the relationship between cultural achievement and political legitimacy that would prove crucial for later Anglo-Saxon cultural development. The memory of Ceol's reign, preserved in the genealogies and historical traditions that maintained Anglo-Saxon cultural identity, would continue to provide inspiration and guidance for future generations of rulers who faced similar challenges of political reconstruction and institutional adaptation. The precedents established during his administration for managing competing interests, balancing scarce resources, and maintaining continuity while adapting to change would prove valuable throughout the Anglo-Saxon period. The historical significance of Ceol extends far beyond the immediate circumstances of late 6th century Wessex to encompass broader questions about the nature of effective leadership, the relationship between individual achievement and civilizational development. His example demonstrates that some of the most important historical contributions come not from dramatic gestures that capture immediate attention, but from patient attention to practical details and long-term institutional building that creates foundations for future achievement. The archaeological evidence that survives from Ceol's period, the fortifications, settlement patterns, and cultural artifacts that testify to continued prosperity and cultural achievement despite political pressures, provides material confirmation of the effectiveness of his approach to governance and the success of his efforts to maintain kingdom stability. Period of significant challenge and uncertainty. The linguistic heritage that connects Ceol's name to the maritime traditions of Anglo-Saxon culture reminds us of the deep connections between royal identity and the cultural values that provided meaning and continuity for early medieval communities. The symbolic significance of kingship as a bridge between human society and divine authority remained as important periods of reconstruction as during times of dramatic expansion and conquest. The international context in which Ceol's reign occurred, particularly the beginning of Christian conversion in neighboring Kent, highlights the broader transformation of Anglo-Saxon civilization that was just beginning during his lifetime and would accelerate dramatically in the decades following his death. His success in maintaining traditional governmental institutions while remaining adaptable to changing circumstances positioned Wessex well for the religious and cultural changes that lay ahead. The genealogical traditions that trace the descent of later West Saxon kings through the Ceolian line create enduring connections between Ceol's reign and some of the greatest achievements in Anglo-Saxon political and cultural development. The institutional innovations and governmental precedents that emerged during his administration would continue to influence English political development through the reigns of kings like Alfred the Great and his successors, who would eventually unite all of Anglo-Saxon England under West Saxon leadership. The scholarly debates that continue to surround various aspects of Ceol's reign, questions about chronology, the extent of his territorial control, and the specific nature of his governmental innovations, reflect the enduring historical significance of developments that occurred during his brief time in power. The ongoing effort to understand and interpret his contributions to Anglo-Saxon political development demonstrates that forgotten kings can prove as historically significant as their more famous contemporaries. The lessons that emerge from careful study of Ceol's reign remain relevant for understanding effective leadership and institutional development in any historical period. His example demonstrates the importance of patience, consensus building, and attention to practical details in creating sustainable political institutions that can adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining essential continuity with established traditions and values. As we conclude our peaceful exploration of this remarkable but often overlooked period in Anglo-Saxon history, we can appreciate how the quiet work of political reconstruction and institutional innovation that characterized Ceol's reign provided exactly the kind of foundational leadership that enabled Anglo-Saxon civilization to achieve some of its greatest successes in the centuries that followed. The memory of the forgotten king who placed kingdom stability above personal glory and long-term institutional development above short-term political advantage continues to offer valuable insights into the nature of effective leadership and the relationship between individual achievement and civilizational progress. In the gentle silence that surrounds our historical meditation on King Ceol's remarkable but brief reign, we can almost hear the whispered conversations and careful deliberations that shaped one of the most crucial periods in early English political development. His legacy lives on, not in dramatic monuments or legendary tales, but in the quiet effectiveness of governmental institutions and cultural traditions that continue to influence political development more than 14 centuries after his death. reminding us once again that history's most significant achievements often emerge from patient attention to practical details rather than spectacular gestures that capture immediate attention but lack lasting substance. The peaceful conclusion of our journey through 6th century Wessex leaves us with a profound appreciation for the complex challenges and remarkable achievements that characterize this formative English history, while also providing gentle inspiration for our own efforts to build institutions and traditions that can serve future generations with the same wisdom and effectiveness that Ceol demonstrated during his brief but transformative reign as King of the West Saxons. As you drift into peaceful slumber, may the gentle rhythm of Anglo-Saxon life and the quiet wisdom of a forgotten king carry you into restful sleep, knowing that you have shared in the remarkable story of how patient leadership and thoughtful governance can shape the destiny of civilizations for centuries to come. Sweet dreams, dear listener, and thank you for joining me on this tranquil journey through the mists of early English history.